The official title of this first lecture is simply Modern Indian Nonfiction. That's a very broad title, but it was really with the idea of reminding us that we are talking not just about fiction and poetry, but also about creative nonfiction, important essays, things like that. That was one impulse. The other is to talk about continuing to talk about some of the foundational writers in Indian national writing or nationalist writing, starting in the 1830s and so forth. So those were the twin impulses. Before I go further, I just want to go over a few terms from post-colonial criticism that I did not have time for yesterday or that I went over very quickly. And I can't say I'm going to explore these in depth today either, but I want us to keep these in mind. First of all, this guides many of the parts of many of the lectures this week. I think one of the key points, and I think you all know this, is that literary criticism in general has taught us is that language is not transparent. Now, that's important, especially with regard to nature writing, because it was presumed, even until fairly recently, that if we describe nature, that's it, right? But as we know, it depends on, first of all, the person's perspective, and secondly, that language mediates everything. So I think we're used to that now as students of literature, but it was not something that was assumed. And so when we read texts, not even so long ago, through the first half of the 20th century, a lot of those writers would assume, including Aldo Leopold, for example, that we can document what we see. It's a more empirical idea. But now we're a little more skeptical of that in a healthy way. So I wanted to mention that. Another term which I did mention, is the idea of cosmopolitanism or metropolitan cultures. The way I mentioned it was that another part of both post-colonial and eco-critical writing that is a challenge is, as I said, most writers are from urban contexts. We are all educated in that. And so how we are already conditioned in some ways to describe nature or subaltern peoples from a particular perspective, right? That's not to say that's wrong. This is not either or situation. It's just that we should keep that in mind, right? So the cosmopolitan viewpoint can be a bit of a privileged viewpoint, right? Where we talk about, and a lot of the first writers, a number of them, not all, are cosmopolitan, right? And so there have been some scholars in the early days of post-colonial critique who saw this as a big problem, right? This was insurmountable. But now we have a more complex understanding that even those critics are cosmopolitan. So it may have to do with how we define that for each context. Two terms I did not introduce that are from the scholar Mary Louise Pratt. She's actually in Spanish and Portuguese studies, are the contact zone and transculturation. The contact zone was a useful way of talking about the colonial context when the Europeans establish contact with locals, and all kinds of interesting things happen in that context zone, right? So the Europeans come, mostly males, come with an imperious eye and so forth. But on the other hand, they also are changed by this interaction and engagement with local peoples, vice versa, right? Or conversely, the local individuals will be changed by the contact with the colonizers. Now, this may seem obvious, But I think if you're interested to look more closely at Pratt's discussion, there's a lot of nuances there, right? And we can't write off all colonizing, all European writing as bad, all post-colonial writing is good, obviously. So she makes a more nuanced argument. Just to raise an example that she does not use, but just because I was teaching it in a survey class recently, was, you all know the novel Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. That's always a useful one, I think, to think about in that respect, right? You have the complexities that he brilliantly shows of that context zone. And each person is different. And then on top of that, even the colonizers are different, right? They're not all the same. So another large term, I'm sorry I'm throwing all these terms, but I think a lot of you are familiar with a number of them. So you'll also know where I'm coming from, what I have in mind, is discourse. We've talked about that, colonial discourse, and I said it was institutionalized ideology, if you want another way of describing it. But I think we have to keep in mind what we're going to, I'll come back to this with Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon tomorrow, I believe, which is the colonization of mind, right? So not total colonization, but the psychological aspects were a big, profound insights by especially Fanon, who was trained as a psychiatrist. And we'll talk about that. The other part of this comes from Foucault, as you know, the idea of discourse, which influences Edward Said's Orientalism. So that's obviously another term. I think we're familiar with that. But there is in post-colonialism, there is and this is a bit theoretical, but there are two thrusts. One is Marxist, right, for material change, but the other is psychoanalytic. And sometimes those critics disagree. But I think those debates are somewhat in the past, more or less. I think we've absorbed the lessons that we have to balance these. So if you're interested, someone I'm not going to talk about, I don't have time for, is Jacques Lacan, the idea of language. His insight was language constructs our psyche so much, right? And the mirror stage. So if you're interested, you can look that up. Colonial writing, travel writing, again, this is not a concept, but a genre that also is fascinating to look at when we see, for example, we'll get to this with the Caribbean a little bit, where then the gaze is returned or put reversed, so that we have not the colonized or the post-colonial travel writing returning the gaze onto the Europeans, right? So we'll keep that in mind. So travel writing is important because that already implies a certain mobility that was the privilege until, it's been some time now, but originally was the privilege of the Europeans, males usually, who would go around and describe all these things, right? So keep that in mind. A couple more terms. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, you know about his debate with Achebe on the use of language. So Things Fall Apart, to use the same example, is written in English in 1958, while Nigeria is still colonized. And Achebe in his essays talks about his colonial education, right? Why is everything, European, right? This is in the 1950s. He wrote the novel at the age of 28, so he certainly was just coming out of that. But he chooses English, right? Because he found, here's the interesting thing that he found, was that this is the paradox of the nation state sometimes. And India, we could relate to this. That Nigeria was made up of many languages, many ethnic groups, two major religions, plus innumerable local folk, as we anthropologists might say, folk religions. So how do you have a Nigerian literature, right? What language are you going to use? If you're going to use Igbo, his language, he makes some interesting remarks that Igbo was oral. It was not written down. Even later than a lot of other places. So it was only in the early 1900s, really, that you start to get a standardization of Igbo, which he said is useful and practical, but not good for aesthetic writing. Isn't that fascinating? So he says, I can't write, if I wrote in my local dialect of Igbo, no one else would, it wouldn't go very far. If I use the standard one, it's practical, but it's serviceable, but it's not capturing the ethos, so I have to use English. Whereas Tiongo advocated for using Gikuyu, which is his mother tongue. He did abandon that. He said, I will only write from now on in English, in Gikuyu, but it was a noble effort, right? And he thought street drama was the way to go. So I mentioned this debate because if you go back for the Caribbean writers, as we'll see, who are very much conditioned by the environment, right? The Caribbean writers in particular grasp onto the figure of Caliban as a canonical character from Shakespeare's The Tempest, who they then can turn back onto the colonizer. And Caliban famously learns the language of the master, right? But then again, it's not like the exact same language. You shape the language to your own ends. And as I always say, no one owns a language, but I know that's debatable. And no group owns a language. Those are hot debates in the world today. But I think it's useful to keep that in mind. Couple more things. We talked about the subaltern, and I think it's useful to keep in mind Spivak's original essay from a long time, 40 years ago almost. I think it was 40 years ago on, or the late 80s, on Three Women's Texts and a Critique of Imperialism, in which, for example, she sees Jane Eyre. Do you know Jane Eyre? A lot of us. These canonical texts, right? Victorian texts. You see Bertha Mason as Creole, right? Who is disregarded. That's why it's fun to teach Jane Eyre with White Sargasso Sea, of course, with Jean Rhys's 1966 modernist novel. Because then you get sort of even though Jean Rhys was white, but that's another thing we'll get to, about Creole can be cultural or ethnic. It can also be a language. So I mentioned Creole. I just wanted to reiterate this. And then we have, of course, Gauri Viswanathan's thesis from 1989, Masks of Conquest, which says, as I tell my American students, the reason you're studying modern literature is partly due to the British colonization of India, all the ironies of history, right? Because in those days, modern literatures were not deemed worthy of study, serious study. It was only Latin and Greek, and then later Sanskrit or Persian. So it was really, even Matthew Arnold advocated that, right? So it was only later and in India, that the study of modern literatures begins. So I want to keep that in the back of our mind. And finally, obvious point, all of these intersect and overlap and condition our view. So I wanted to give you a quick overview of those, even at the risk of repeating them today. So to get to, and thanks for mentioning modern, what modern means. There are other terms I may use, sometimes assuming too much, right? We have to stipulate our terms. So especially if you write an article or a book, you need to say, how am I using this term, right? So, of course, there are many modernities, but that's another topic. But when I refer to modern in this course, it will be late modernity, really not in the postmodern sense, but mainly when I say late modernity, I mean really starting with the Industrial Revolution. So here's where a number of developments intersect in interesting ways. So, for example, I mentioned how colonialism and imperialism are part of globalization, one and the same. and how that also is part of the modern spread of the modern ideas and condition, for better or worse. And then I was talking with your professor, Dr. Mohan, about a guy named Dussel, who is talks about transmodernity. So there are a lot of, if you're interested, a lot of responses to this idea of what we mean by modern. What I'm, for the purposes of our lectures, I think keep in mind this idea of globalization, the spread of language, and also the paradoxically, this is also the era of print capitalism and what Ben Benedict Anderson calls imagined communities. Now, there's a kind of push-pull dynamic. It's hard to say a chicken and egg thing. Literacy and education both spread, and everyday people become the subjects of artistic works. That's new, right? Mostly in the 19th century. There are some exceptions before that, but generally. The use of colloquial language is another part. So Bankim Chandra, as we'll see, that's a big part of what he does. Now, I'm not a Bangla speaker, but that idea has, many writers have found ways to innovatively talk about that. For example, you could go back to Dante, right, 1300, Chaucer, late 1300s, Camões, who's a Portuguese writer, 1570s, and they are using everyday language. They refuse to use like Latin or whatever, right? Now, that's a little different because when we get to the late modern time, to continue with modernity, we're talking about the idea of the spread of print, right? Mass production, reaching a lot of people, newspapers. Those early writers did not have that luxury, right? Dante and Chaucer were still in the age before print. So how do you have to copy everything, right? So it stays within a pretty small sphere. Whereas we see what's happening in Europe, and then also with Bankim Chandra in India, with the masterly use of Sanskrit at times, but sometimes colloquial Bengali. And you find this true of most of the most writers around the world who are thought of as national writers tend to be ones that use ordinary language, because that's what reaches the people. There are some exceptions, but if you keep it too highbrow, it's not going to work. So now the Romantics did that, right? Even though we may think of them as high-flown, remember Wordsworth and Coleridge talk about in 1798 lyrical ballads. That was seen as a contradiction, an oxymoron. How can ballads be lyrical, right? And they said, no, it can be, right? So that's why it's almost like it was scandalous at first, like Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. It's very, it's like a kid's rhyme, but then it's saying a lot of things. So this was something that was, I don't want to say it was picked up. It wasn't just that the Bankim was copying the Europeans, but that maybe it's an instinctive notion that you want to reach larger populace. Now, I just want to point out, and this is all by way of a larger introduction, Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities is important, but we know Partha Chatterjee responded to it. What Benedict Anderson said is really important, that a nation, you could be hundreds of kilometers apart, but if you're reading the same newspaper, you can imagine it to be part of a community, right? That seemed, until then, everyone had to see each other, right, pretty much. So, and then this was facilitated by print capitalism. He says this interesting statement, ultimately this fraternity, this idea of seeing common goals, makes it possible over the past 2 centuries, and he's writing in the 1980s, so you're talking since the revolutions in America and France. It makes it possible for so many millions of people not so much to kill as willingly to die for such limited imaginings. So that's fascinating that you can, die for that. That's why he talks about the tomb of the unknown soldier. Why unknown? Because it can stand for everyone. But Partha Chatterjee did say, and you'd have to read all this, it's quite sophisticated, but I can't do justice. He's persuasively shown that while this is useful, it is all European-based, even though Anderson worked on Indonesia. And he points out that the anti-colonial struggle was already there. We're going to see this as we know, in Gare Baire, or The Home in the World, right? Which is this idea of the interior space becomes the spiritual domain and the space in which you can inculcate or maybe incubate an anti-colonial struggle that you cannot outwardly do under colonialism in public. It still tends to be conditioned by men, but we can talk about that. But anyway, he does say, for example, that it's also the vernacular paintings by Raja Ravi Verma and others, calendar art, all of those things. And there are these fantastic scholars, and maybe some of you know them, Tanika Sarkar, Suzy Taru, Uma Chowdhury, and many others who write so persuasively about the complexities of this home domesticity and its role in the national imagination. I mention all this because it's an example of how we shouldn't just use European concepts without scrutinizing them. Some of them are great, like Foucault's idea of discourse, right? But Foucault never gave a thought to colonialism either, right? So Edward Said sees that, he uses that in an effective way, but not to use them blindly. And there are a growing, by the way, and I'm not as well versed, but a growing development these days is using not just indigenous, but also non-European models of viewing the world, viewing the nation state, and so forth. So, the last thing I wanted to say today, and I know this is taking longer than I thought, but is the term wilderness I mentioned, right? We talked about. I forgot to mention an important writer who wrote some decades ago, actually it was 1995, 30 years ago, William Cronin, who talked about, I love his title, The Trouble with Wilderness. He's an American historian. He's not a literary critic. And the subtitle is, Or Getting Back to the Wrong Nature, in which he describes the history of environmentalism in the U.S. to show that this movement has, remember John Muir and these people, has idealized certain landscapes as untouched by humans. But as he shows, the ideal of wilderness derived from 19th century European notions of the sublime and the sacred. So I don't think I made that connection yesterday, that this idea of the sublime and the sacred from Europe informed John Muir and these Americans, and that in turn, and they become a model, by the way. The idea of the national parks, right, becomes a model for parks around the world. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And this essay, as another noted scholar named Ursula Heise, who works in, I think she's at Stanford or Berkeley, one of those, I can't remember. She notes that this essay prompted a re-examination of established environmental authors as well as a broadening of the canon. So we have to broaden that canon out. Greg Girard also gives us a useful, in his book Eco-Criticism, talks about the paradox that on the one hand, we know that humans destroy nature, but I don't know if you've seen, I don't know if in India, I think they have similar ads of the Jeeps and SUVs and all going out into nature, right? So this can go wherever you want to really enjoy nature. So you see the paradox, right? We know that. the selling of wilderness, I guess is what I'm getting at. And we still sell that. We sell retreats. We sell like Kaveri Nambison's novel about the Kurg area. I actually went there about 12 years ago to a jungle forest retreat. I'm thinking, this is really strange. I'm paying a lot of money for this. But so this paradox of selling really good ideas, maybe some aspects are good. So, okay, I'll stop there for that. Now, so today I'm going to look at Henry Derozio to start with. And I don't know how many have, I'm just curious, how many have read Derozio? Just a few of you? Yeah. Oh, okay, good. Because I think Roshinka Chowdhury has really done a lot to show how these writers are important. This was he lived only 22 years, 1809 to 1831. Wrote in English. He was Eurasian, Anglo-Indian, but he was very vigorously and proudly Indian. And he wrote in English. So what I love about some of these writings, we're going to get to the poems later today, but his writings are, remember that this is a colonial context. He can't say there is censorship. So also he's very young, and so is the idea of modern nation in India. So how do you articulate that? Well, not surprisingly, a lot of that is articulated through a romantic imagery of trees, flowers, landscapes. That connects us back to the eco-critical. So Derozio, I'll just read a bit of one of Chowdhury's essays called The Politics of Naming. This was in Modern Asian Studies. The Politics of Naming, Derozio in Two Formative Moments of Literary and Political Discourse, Calcutta, 1825 to 1831. So he's writing from early teen years. He became a teacher as a teenager and in Hindu college. And so she says he used the pseudonym an East Indian for several poems he published in his lifetime. And he may have used it again in a heated controversy that played itself out. So there were these debates that happened in the different journals, the India Gazette. Now, this was again modeled on the really interesting debates that were going on in the Edinburgh Review and other things in England. And his editorial, the occasion was an editorial comment upon a community of office goers in the city, or as they were spelled, Sirkars, right, Sircars, who had set up a literary association. This editorial was widely perceived to be reactionary, and civil society responded vigorously in protest. The sequence of editorials and letters published on this issue, so this shows the debates that are going on. As people are thinking, how do we proceed, right? Which seem to have been written by Englishmen, East Indians, and Indians alike, demonstrated remarkable liberalism of spirit and free-thinking attitude to ethnicity that was soon to disappear in the stiffening boundaries of a racially divided society. So again, we cannot make a monolith of colonialism. It waxes and wanes. The degree to which it is enforced, it's always bad, but the degree to which it is enforced. And I know William Dalrymple has written about this as a historian. 1825 was also the year that Derozio began to publish politically in the poetry columns of newspapers and periodicals in the city. So again, he's 16 years old. By the time he died in 1831, he had published 2 books of poems and had created a revolution of sorts among the radicalized youth of Hindu college. Wow, 200 years ago. Amazing. From which he had been dismissed for his role in their alienation from tradition. In 1831, a few months before his death, Derozio addressed a mammoth meeting called to commemorate the return of you don't have to remember this name, John Ricketts, an East Indian representative, from his mission to the Houses of Parliament. Using these two occasions, this is more important, the public correspondence and the meeting, both concerned with the politics of naming. Rusinko says in her essay, will then attempt to present the early radical interventions of the mixed race community, the Eurasians, as they were called then, in initiating a discourse of civic rights and human dignity, which led ultimately to organize attempts at constitutional change and political reform in India, whose estimation is underrated in present-day context. So she's, as I said, she's done a lot to show the importance of these. What I also find interesting is that we have people like Derozio, who is kind of in between, right? Sort of they're treated as that. Sometimes favored by the British, but not always, because of their mixed race. And so I think that there's been a lot of research on Anglo-Indians and their literature, but maybe not as much, as Chaudhry says, as what they've contributed to the national debate about what it means to be a nation that encompasses everyone, right? So I think that's important. So that was my little snippet on Derozio. We're going to get to his poems in a few minutes. Also, now we come to Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, his essays, not Anandamath, right? So we'll get to Anandamath, which I might talk a little longer about because I've written about it. But I thought it would be useful to just glance at a few lines of tribute to him by Tagore and Aurobindo Ghosh, right? To show how important they thought of him. Then we can look at just snippets of lines from his work. Now, not all of these lines are directly addressing nature. I don't mean that. But they are part of that larger context. Anandamath is much more clearly so. So what Bankim Chandra, in a poem called Bankim Chandra that Tagore wrote, he said in English, it's been translated recently, we need on our journey torches to keep the darkness of night at bay. Our bedside lamps keep blowing out in the wind. Sterile deeds are destroyed by the cruel march of time. Whatever stagnates is swept away like trash, leaving no trace. Very colloquial, earthy, right? Then I'll skip a few lines. He says, you have fulfilled this prayer, O Bankim. The boon that time has entrusted to your hands is not lifeless or inert. The stream of new literature bursting forth at your magic touch, interesting, wakes with its ceaseless flow new life here in the mind of Bengal. A few lines further. This is your surging, echoing message today, Bankim. This is the stream on which your name and achievements ride. Again, loosely naturalistic, the stream, not specifically, but loosely naturalistic. Very much Tagore's style. And so, sure of your survival, I join the muse of Bengal in singing your praise. I'll say a little more about some of these terms as we go along. Sri Aurobindo titled he wrote an essay as a tribute. These were collected in an anthology. He called him Rishi Bankim Chandra. There are many who, lamenting the bygone glories of the great and ancient nation, speak as if the rishis of old, the inspired creators of thought and civilization, were a miracle of our heroic age, not to be repeated among degenerate men and in our distressful present. Interesting term, in our distressful present. Aurobindo is writing late 1800s, but mostly into the early 1900s, right? And very much part of that, a counterpart, kind of going alongside the beginnings of the Gandhian movement, say in 1915 and so forth. So, and he says, just let me read one more line. Among the rishis of the later age, we have at last realized that we must include the name of the man who gave us the reviving mantra, which is creating a new India, the mantra Vande Mataram. Now, I will talk about that song too, which I know is an important one. So, coming from Bunkim. So it's interesting that they feel the need, this was in the early, maybe 100 years ago, let's say, they felt the need to champion Bankim Chandra, right? Whereas I think one reason perhaps is that he was more read in Bengal, despite the song kind of became detached from the novel, than he was in other parts of India, where Sri Aurobindo, of course, went to ultimately to Puducherry, right, and so forth. So, and Tagore traveled the world. So, I think that was their impetus. This is an interesting statement to give us this context, where Aurobindo says, "No nation can grow without finding a fit and satisfying medium of expression for the new self." Right? That talks about language, talks about modernity, into which it is developing. Without a language which shall, he doesn't mean necessarily one literal language, he means a kind of expressive force. Without a language which shall give permanent shape to its thoughts and feelings and carry every new impulse swiftly and triumphantly into the consciousness of all. It was Bunkim's first great service to India that he gave the race which stood in its vanguard such a perfect and satisfying medium. He was blamed for corrupting the purity of the Bengali tongue. So here we get this concepts of purity, messiness, but more importantly, I just wish to show, and again, this is my modest, contribution. I'm not an expert on these writers, to show the ways in which they themselves saw themselves as modern, and trying to negotiate, trying to say, we need to have an Indian modernity, rightfully so, right? And all nations would do that in different ways. So, yeah, okay. Let me skip now down. There's also the idea that Aurobindo loved from Bankim Chandra, which is the idea of maternal mother India, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. He says, let me just read this last bit from Aurobindo. "It is not till the motherland reveals herself to the eye of the mind as something more than a stretch of earth or mass of individuals. It is not till she takes shape as a great divine, capital D, and maternal power in a form of beauty that can dominate the mind and seize the heart, that these petty fears and hopes vanish in the all-absorbing passion for the mother and its service, and the patriotism that works miracles and saves a doomed nation. It is not in this that it is born," he's saying, right? And it's interesting that Aurobindo would, this is a footnote, it's interesting that he so much so, he pushes the idea of the maternal, that he then, of course, identifies the mother in the Aurobindo ashram as sort of the beacon, who was not Indian. That's another story, right? We could talk about. My insight here, my thought, and again, I'm modest contribution, is that we have this classic paradox in post-colonial thinking, but any nation, which is that on the one hand, we are tied to this particular geography, to particular soil. But on the other hand, we also want to transcend that, because not everyone's in the same soil. So if you're in Bengal, that's very different from Tamil Nadu, right? So how are you going to connect those? That's the challenge. America's a bit unique and kind of wild west. The American idea is it tends to be a little less rooted, even though they claim they are, because of course they were a settler nation. And you can find the same sentiments in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand a little bit, because there are the indigenous people we talked about who claim the land. So that's very complex. So what does Bankim Chandra say? I better hurry up here. Let me just read one snippet, and then I'll close. This is because I'm going to get to Anandamat. He says, we Bengalis are strangely apt to forget that it is only through the Bengali that only through Bengali that the people can be moved. We preach in English and harangue in English and write in English, perfectly forgetful that the great masses whom it is absolutely necessary to move in order to carry out any project of social reform remain stone deaf to all our eloquence. Right? Very aware of this, right? Not a new situation, but especially, I think, challenging in a multilingual. Remember, I mentioned Nigeria, which Achebe talks about. That's the challenge, right? And so he's very attuned to this, and I think we could say a lot more about this. Okay, let me skip ahead. Where are we in time? Let me just check my. Okay, so I think we still have time for this, and yeah. Okay, so he also says this is interesting, where Bunkim is writing. These are from an anthology, as I said, and so they're taken out of context from different essays. He wrote a lot of newspaper columns, as you know. Some of you know more than I do about this. He says English civilization has, and he was writing in English and Bengali. So, English civilization has pulled down the 330 million deities of Hinduism and set up in the total space once occupied by them its own tutelary deities, comfort, and his brother, respectability. He's always a bit coy and sometimes sardonic. He's very good at that. What I wanted to, maybe the takeaway, as we like to say, what do we take away from this, is, from my readings anyway, of scholars of Bunkim, like Tapan Ray Chaudhary or Partha Chatterjee, of course, and many others, Tanika Sarkar, is that he was interesting, but I think a classic situation of a modern individual in the 1800s who wants, on the one hand, rightly, understandably, to maintain something of the Indian, authentic Indian ethos, and its legends, the Puranas, and all these things. At the same time, he wants to historicize and use some of the science, the empiricism that he saw as valuable, as a valuable contribution of the British. So, for example, he famously wrote a long essay in which he wanted to historicize Krishna, right? So that's interesting, right? There was a big debate at the time, apparently, because he wants to, in the same way that maybe the Europeans had historicized Christ, or, this idea. In fact, George Eliot, the famous Victorian writer, translated from German a book about the historical Christ. She was an atheist, but she translated it. And the idea was not, their idea was not, in Europe, was not so much religious as to say, well, what is the role of history in this, right? So what Bunkim does is this is his nonfiction side, right? This is his maybe non-poetic side, is he has this very analytical mind that says, we have to, if we're going to be a modern nation, we have to find ways to historicize our past. That's his argument, right? It's not that everyone agreed with it, right? So I think that's one of the takeaways here. But he did say, he famously mentioned that you must keep up a critical spirit, as he said, a critical spirit. He's not saying, I think he was always willing to learn. He had some big blind spots, as we'll know, with certain respect to religion, but certainly he was a complex individual who's, like a lot of complex thinkers, one part of their writing may contradict another, right? So, okay, let me go to briefly to Ramesh Chandra Dutt, who, another interesting person who, what he does, a lot of, like Michael Madhusudan Dutt and Ramesh Chandar and a lot of writers, even Ram Mohan Roy, they would separate their poetry, or especially with Dutt, right, and Michael Madhusudan Dutt, they would separate their poetic or creative work from their analytic. So Dutt was actually a history of economics. He was an economist, very well trained. So he wrote a history of the economics of India from way back, right? But he felt you had to keep that separate from the sort of poetic. So he translated works into Bengali and vice versa. Whereas Bankim said, I don't have to separate that, right? So sometimes he would not. But here's what he said. He was an Indian civil servant, of course, translator of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and the literature of Bengal. Very compendious volume. He was the first major economist to argue for what was later recognized as true, which is that for centuries, so he was the first one to write about this, until the advent of British rule in 1757, India was one of the world's great manufacturing and agricultural regions, because British colonialism had subdued that memory, and that the British East India Company discouraged Indian manufacturers in the early years of British rule in order to encourage the rising manufacturers of England. That becomes common knowledge later, but not at the time he wrote this, right? In the 1880s and so forth. Or he did the empirical research. So we might look at a book from a work, and this is where it fits in with literature, from his massive 1891 work, A History of Civilization in India based on Sanskrit literature, which ranges from the Vedic period to 1194. Wow, that's ambitious, right? I can't imagine that. And he doesn't even get up to the very far, 1894. He opens the chapter of Ashoka the Great. I haven't read the whole book, so I'm just snippets. Ashoka the Great and his edicts. And he wrote it in English. So he says, the Buddhist period begins with the brilliant reign of Ashoka the Great. No greater prince has ever reigned in India since the Aryans first colonized this country, and no succeeding monarch equaled his glory, if we only accept Vikramaditya of the 6th century and the great Akbar of the 16th century. But the claims of Ashoka to greatness rest less on the extent of his empire and his prowess, so this is an important point, than on the liberal and Catholic, small c, spirit which inspired his internal administration and his foreign policy, and the fervent love of truth which have made him a household name from Siberia to Ceylon. No monarch of India has exerted such influence on the history of the world by his zeal for righteousness and virtue. That's an interesting way to see it, right? So he's not couching this in the way that a lot of the Europeans were talking about Ashoka. Yes, of course, he has a big army, but it's more important to think about this as his. So that, I think, gives us a barometer of, or a sense of where Dutt is coming from. Of course, he died in 1909 before some of the really got going, the modern nationalist movement really got going. And yet he contributed to it a lot just by his writings. Now, this is not, as I told you, this is not directly relatable to eco-criticism yet, but it is part of the larger context in which people like Bankim Chandra and Derozio and others, Derozio was a little earlier, but this sort of sense of forging a new nation. And what should we be proud of in this idea of new nation? I think finally today, if I'm not mistaken, yeah, so we're right on schedule. Tagore's The Religion of the Forest, right? In 1931, there are different versions of this, and I don't know if he, sometimes he translated his own work, right? And some people said maybe you shouldn't have, but because his Bengali is so brilliant. But anyway, extracts from an anthology published in 1997, simply called Rabindranath Tagore, an anthology edited by Krishna Dutt and Andrew Robinson. So they note that although Bankim was the first novelist in India, Rabindranath remains the only novelist in Bengali to have been widely read by non-Indians back then, right? So if you're a new nation, it's not, you have to, on the one hand, speak to your people, but on the other hand, you want to, as Nehru said, enter the comity of nations, right? Because that's also the sense of the modern, is to say, where do we fit in, right? If you go back to, say, China, the way it famously shut its doors in the late 1400s, after amazing ships and conquests, they suddenly said, nope, we can't, Japan did that for a time, we cannot be sort of infected by the rest of the world. But in the modern sense, there's a realization you can't exist alone, unless maybe you're Trump. Sorry, you can't exist alone. I shouldn't put that in. But unless you recognize that you are in conversation with other countries. And we know that the Indian and nationalist movement had so much contact with the Irish, for example, right? Which is why, of course, I'd forgotten this, why Achebe Things Fall Apart from The Second Coming by Yeats. So back to this, it says, here's a quote, "If there be any truth absolutely unrelated to humanity, then for us it is absolutely non-existing." This is from an imagined conversation with Einstein, all right? So if there be any truth absolutely unrelated to humanity, maybe it doesn't matter. I mean, what does it matter to us, right? We're concerned. That's what he said. On Bankim, he said, of course, the chief glory of Bankim is that he ushered in an age in which Bengalis felt pleased and proud to speak and write in their own tongue. On Kalidasa, he says, so he's wide-ranging in his consciousness of, and remember, people outside the country are reading Tagore, right? On Kalidasa, he says, his mind was oppressed by material things while living in the city of Ujjain, and there he let his thoughts escape to the vision of Tapovana and into life, light, and freedom. On Kabir, it is nonetheless true that most of our great saints of that time who took up this cry in their life and teachings and songs came from the lower classes. So subaltern, one of them being the Muslim weaver Kabir, one a cobbler, and several coming from ranks of society whose touch would pollute the drinking water of the respectable section of Hindus, and thus the living voice of India ever found its medium even in the darkest days of our downfall. Very modern sensibility, right? Sort of trying to reach a broad India, also very conscious of their place. Again, I'm saying perhaps the obvious here, but anyway, I'll just conclude here with a few more thoughts, and I'll get to the forest now. He says, I love India not because I cultivate the idolatry of geography, but because I have had the chance to be born in her soil, not because I have had the chance to be born in her soil, but because she has saved through tumultuous ages the living words that have issued from the illuminated consciousness of her great sons. Interesting, right? Very Tagorean, sort of almost mystic. He was a kind of a mystic in some ways. So what about the forest? What about Mother India, right? Tagore's meditations on the ethos of the forest in India's deep cultural history point to an issue that has preoccupied some Indian historians, including the subaltern studies collectives Ranjit Guha and Dipesh Chakrabarti, as we know, which is the degree to which historical studies should draw on literature, especially poetry, to help convey the ethos of particular times. As I don't know if you've read Provincializing Europe, but which is Chakrabarti's great book from maybe a couple decades ago. But it's interesting how much he turns to poetry to make his points. So that a lot of historians are now turning to literature to try to get a sense of that ineffable aspect of the ordinary people's response. And I would say, more for our interest, the response to the natural world, right? That's something that no empirical account will satisfy. Roshika Chaudhary, again, in a different essay called The Flute, Durantien, and Subaltern Misreadings of Tagore, which is a fascinating essay, she quotes a 1941 conversation Tagore had on this topic with younger writers. I hope this is worthwhile as we conclude this section on Tagore. So he's advocating the sense of the forest more as a kind of sensibility than necessarily a material forest. Yes, he does talk about actual plants, trees, in his autobiography, for example. But here he's trying, because not everyone has access to the forest, right? I mean, Rajasthan, parts of it don't have forests. So you can't just say, oh, everyone should go to the forest, right? So what is the ethos? And I think that's what she's trying to get at. So here's the section. Pundits judge the merits and demerits of literature, but you have brought together the joy of pure enjoyment. On one side, there is flavor, rasa, and on the other side, enjoyment. If pedantry or panditya is brought between these, then that makes a different form, rup. Its field is different. He had complained elsewhere, writes Roshinka Chaudhary, similarly, that in our country we call the display of book learning criticism. I don't agree. On the one side, there is the thing to be appreciated or tasted, and on the other side, the one who enjoys. When these two meet, then that is criticism. Whether the thing is Mughal or Pathan, feudal or capitalist, there is no point in looking for that. It is full of rasa. You have liked it. Speak of these things properly. Don't bring pedantry. The occasion for this was criticism of Tagore by people like Ranjit Guha. This is later criticism, that the practice of history had become stultified by factuality, right? And that history writing therefore needs a kind of poetic outlook that Tagore represented. Chaudhary shows that Guha misread this, and he recognizes that Tagore is upset with these literary critics. But Tagore, she observed, and this is, I'm going to conclude with these couple of points, was actually criticizing literary critics for accusing him of political disengagement and elitist sentiment. That's a common challenge. So we have a lot of criticism, especially by Marxists. That's the thrust of a lot of post-colonial critique. Also subaltern studies, a lot of Marxist, which is great. I'm just neutral observation, is that that tends to say that literature is in the service of something great else. In other words, that literature has to be politically attuned, right? But as I tell my students, there's no prescription for literature, what literature has to do. Literature has to do with sentiments. And so he was reacting, rightly so. He was annoyed that the literary critics were dismissing him for being elitist and rarefied, right? So this is the danger or the challenge that we meet. So, one last minute here. So I think this is worth thinking about for all, that's why you mentioned these. This is worth thinking about for everything we do. You folks as students, but also teachers. Criticism of seemingly apolitical or overly aestheticized writing is understandable to a degree. These are my words. Given that numerous tyrants in the past have coveted artistic works, from Roman emperors to Mussolini, right? I mean, you can be the worst dictator and love art, right? So there's an understandable skepticism of that. I agree with Chaudhary, however, that art should never be prescriptive, that by definition, great art depends on creative freedom. No wonder even seemingly benign literary works have been censored by rulers. across the globe. There's a big, in the US now, all these, you can't censor publishing things, but the parents of school libraries are all trying to stop all these really very benign novels, right? It's become crazy. So Chaudhary reminds us that it is not only the novel that narrates the nation, because that's a big argument in post-colonial, noting that Bengali poetry, in fact, led Bengal's independence movement in the early 1900s, not the novel. Although we have Bankim's 1882 novel, but poetry did. The lesson for us, I think, is not to read literature for its instrumental value, but instead for its aesthetic ethos, for the aesthetic ethos it conveys to readers who may thereby more clearly apprehend the reality of the subject matter. That's the other, remember I said at the start of this talk, language is not transparent. These literary critics in the 1930s who were criticizing Tagore in 1940s, in the thick of the, understandably, we have to remember their times, anti-British nationalism, were saying, you have to be more political active, right? You can understand that. But he says that if you say that, then you're saying that art is sort of a footnote to history. Does that make sense? Whereas, I mean, maybe art is life. You know, I mean, what is it we're fighting for? Right? You establish a nation, then what? Right? Is it just to have a border, an army, things like that? So this does not mean that we should perform only close readings divorced from everyday affairs. Of course, I love history. I use a lot of interdisciplinary work. Obvious bigotry is unforgivable. What this does mean, as Chaudhary advocates, is that we must be open to great writing's invitation to examine our own ethical responses to the world, whether or not these accord with those of the narrator or the characters. And I'll stop there. Thank you. End of lecture 1. 4. I have to remember the numbers here. Okay, we have a little break, I believe. So about 10 minutes. Start. I will start slowly in case people are coming in for lecture 5. And this one again is rudimentary title, Modern Indian Literature, Survey of Some Classic Texts. I should perhaps have said survey of some classic literary texts. We looked at some nonfiction, and today I have to speak louder. So we'll look at nonfiction. We're going to look at some literary samples today. So we were talking about Derozio, and it's worth listening to just snippets of some of his poems, and I want you to see if you can hear any of the romantic poets that we looked at yesterday, if you can hear them here. To My Native Land, a famous poem. My country, exclamation mark, in thy days of glory past, a beauteous halo circled round thy brow, and worshipped as a deity thou wast. Where is thy glory, where the reverence now? Thy eagle pinion is chained down at last, and groveling in the lowly dust art thou. Thy minstrel hath no wreath to weave for thee, save the sad story of thy misery. Well, let me dive into the depths of time and bring from out the ages that have rolled a few small fragments of those wrecks sublime, which human eye may never more behold, and let the guerdon of my labor be, my fallen country, one kind wish for thee. Very much a poem about being under the colonial thumb. It also, if you remember Shelley's, just as an example, Ode to the West Wind, right? Which says, if I were a dead leaf thou mightest bear, if I were a swift cloud to fly with thee. Now, in Shelley's case, though, for the Romantics, they were not necessarily addressing a country or their compatriots. They were addressing a kind of spirituality through nature. Most of them were maybe deists. They were not religious in the traditional sense, whereas nor is Derozio necessarily. But Derozio will channel or shift this to the addressing the country, so the thy and the thou are an imagined community, right? Which has not yet been formed totally. So he's writing in English in one part of British India, and it begs the question, which I think Roshinkar Chowdhury will help you answer, and I cannot, which is, who then are the implied readers here, right? Does he imagine that some English sympathizers will read this as well? Certainly he's addressing consciously his fellow Indians. The other thing is, obvious points, the word sublime, as you notice, comes up a lot, right? And so that's very much in the Romantic vein. It's also this idea of a individual expressing his very individual feelings, right? As a modern person, and therefore the exclamation marks, right? Meaning I'm trying to accentuate the feelings that, very much. And I think that is something not brand new, but relatively new at the time. And so we keep that in mind. The other thing is, you can hear more of in the next poem that I assigned, which I know you may not have had time to read, Sonnet to the Pupils of the Hindu College, is very much more, has much more natural imagery. For example, it starts, expanding like the petals of young flowers, I watch the gentle opening of your minds, right? This is less nationalistic on the surface because it's talking about education, about opening the intellect. And he goes on and says, the sweet loosening of the spell that binds your intellectual energies and powers that stretch like young birds in soft summer hours, their wings to try their strength. Oh, how the winds of circumstances and freshening April showers of early knowledge and unnumbered kinds of new perceptions shed their influence, and how you worship truth's omnipotence. Maybe, it's fairly self-explanatory, but when I said on the surface it is about the opening of minds, but obviously the coded message is open your minds and see the reality that you're under colonial rule, right? If you put that together with his other poems and writings. So, and to be fair, here's where the complexity of colonialism comes in. He had an English champion. So he had also, both in his lifetime and late in the 19th century, there was also E.P. Thompson, a famous Marxist English historian, actually Thompson's father, I should say. E.P. Thompson grew up partly in India, but became a famous Marxist historian of England. So I think we have to keep that in mind. The influence of European romantic imagery, which Derozio admired, is clear. He admirably enlists these images to express his pride in India, right? He is not yet confident enough, perhaps, he's very young, to use the specific floral imagery from the Indian subcontinent, right? He doesn't always do that, right? Now, Toru Dutt, we'll get to in a minute, she does, but maybe he just wasn't quite confident enough. I'm not sure. But his emphasis on education and on intellectual energies is representative of this generation of Indian writers. So that's another reason we read him, is not just his unique poems at a young age, at a formative time in Indian history, literary as well as political, but also he was speaking for that voice. And I think because he died so young, right, as Hausman says, to an athlete dying young, you tend to then aggrandize, I'm not saying unfairly, but, it's sort of like, here's someone who was giving his life. It'd be interesting to imagine what would, if he had lived through longer, right? See, that's what novelists can do. One of you can write a novel on the older Derozio. I'm not sure he'd be happy if I was, this was part of an exam, but it's interesting to think about. Toru Dutt. I'm sorry, I missed one more thing. Let me just come back. I was reading ahead in my notes. The first poem, and some of this is, I think we're offline, but I'm back. That was magic. So the first poem is more explicitly nationalistic, despite its British motifs and style. Obviously, he similarly repeats a European trope at the time that viewed many regions of the world, including India and China, as once great civilizations that had fallen. So it's not just because they're under colonial rule, but he's kind of imbibed the narrative of the Romantics I mentioned, the Germans and the British and all, that it's the ancient India that we need to cultivate. That was very patronizing, right? Because it said, well, modern Indians don't know enough. We have to show them what they've lost, right? Of course, no one had lost that. It was just they hadn't been expressing it in English, right? So we have to remember, of course, that no Indian writing at this time could openly challenge British rule. So I think perhaps the other thing to give him the benefit of the doubt is that these are restrained calls for past glories. Toru Dutt, as I started with. She's a little later. She also died at 21. But she's maybe a generation later, 1856 to 77. She, along with, and I'm quoting scholars here, along with Derozio, Manmohan Ghosh, Sarojini Naidu, is sort of the inaugurator of Indo-Anglian poetry, right? That branch of writing. That has a big role to play. She published 2 volumes of poetry and a novel in French. So her father took she and her sister to Europe. They studied in both England and in the continent, and she knew fluent French. Her Anglophile father took them to Europe when she was 13 to offer them the best education, right? That's interesting. That shows foresight. Even if it's very Europeanized, it's still remarkable for offering a daughter. The sisters studied in Cambridge and then in parts of the continent, and there was a series they attended called Higher Lectures for Women. That's interesting that they offered something like that, right? There weren't many such offerings, right, at the time. So this poem, she's important both for her poetry and as being a rare woman writer at the time. So it's not just that she's writing, has this interesting education, but there aren't many women writers at the time from India or even in Europe, relatively speaking. Our casuarina tree. So here's a poem. Like a huge python winding round and round the rugged trunk, indented deep with scars, up to its very summit near the stars, a creeper climbs, in whose embraces bound no other tree could live. But gallantly the giant wears the scarf, and flowers are hung in crimson clusters, all the boughs among, whereon all days are gathered bird and bee. And oft at nights the garden overflows with one sweet song that seems to have no close, sung darkling from our tree while men repose. Very clearly in the vein of English Romanticism, very much filled with, notice the flowers aren't specified yet, right, in this poem. She's fairly young when she writes this, but interesting image of a giant python. So I won't read the whole poem, but I'll just specify a few notes. There's also the clear influence of Wordsworth I hear here in the terms of memory. It's poignant because she's very young, right? But she's already, from 13, she's not been back to India. And so, understandably, that's really makes her homesick. So she's imagining this in Europe, right? So we have to remember that. She talks about that hoar tree, H-O-A-R, which is the old-fashioned word for, there's a word hoary for frost-ridden, glinted tree, but there's also the word H-O-A-R. Hoar could just mean older, like an old tree, right? It was already starting to be old-fashioned at this time, right, in the 1870s. Is this an intentional archaism? That is to say, an intentional use of old-fashioned English? I don't know. But, arguably, it is. But in any case, the tree becomes, the casuarina tree, it becomes that symbol of her longing for home. I think that's the takeaway. She talks about memory, talks about it is the tree's lament and eerie speech that haply to the unknown land may reach. She talks about every time the music rose, before mine inner vision rose a form sublime. Thy form, O tree, as in my happy prime I saw thee in my own loved native clime. So here she's addressing a tree. Partly these were safe topics for young women, right? But it's a tree that's in India, right? And so it's not unlike Derosio's address to his country, if that makes sense. So if the tree is a stand-in, an indexical figure for the country. So we have to read these in the context of their times, understanding where and when they were written, as for all literature, right? Remember yesterday we alluded, in a slightly tangential note, but Rob Nixon's point about V.S. Naipaul having a double environmental consciousness, sort of a double, because he's from Trinidad and Tobago, but he wants to be English, and then he goes there. Here we have, it's very different, but that idea of double consciousness, I think, pertains because she, on the one hand, emulates, she loves that European, I would say European broadly, ethos and learning, but she misses her Bengal, right? So I think that's important to keep in mind. So memory and a lament, a loss. And again, it's very poignant for someone so young, right, to be feeling that. She has one more, and then I'll come to Anandamat. I can't remember exactly when it started, but I hope I'm on the right time. This poem is called Sonnet, The Lotus. Now here's a more specific reference to an Indian an Indian flower. Love came to Flora asking for a flower that would of flowers be undisputed queen, the lily and the rose. Long, long had been rivals for that high honor. And she goes on like this, but she says, thus between flower factions, so no, the rose is better, no, the lily, rang the strife in Psyche's bower. Give me a flower delicious as the rose and stately as the lily in her pride. And of what color? Rose red. Love first chose, then prayed, no, lily white, or both provide. And Flora gave the lotus rose red dyed, D-Y-E-D, and lily white, the queenliest flower that blows. So again, interesting way of balancing the two inspirations, the two sensibilities that she has. So that's Derozio and the poetry, just a taste. Now we come to Anandamat, which is, of course, a famous novel that has been written much about. I rely on the authoritative translation of Julius Lipner, who's from Kolkata originally, at the University of Cambridge or Oxford, I can't remember now. And he published this about 20 years ago, almost. And his introduction is 100 pages long. In other words, the introduction is like a book. It's amazing. I learned a lot, not just about the novel, but about the context in which it was produced, right? And it's interesting to see the debates that we are now familiar with, which is other readers of Anandamat. I mean, they had all kinds of, generally it was well received and so forth, but other Bengalis saying, well, you know, you're not, what about it? Was this did you really have they were worried about the actual forest, right? The literal forest, debating whether he had one forest in mind or another, which kind of misses the point, right? So you still have these debates, even today, right? You'll have it all over the world about, does a writer have one thing, specific point in mind? And that is to mistakenly make a direct line between representation and the natural world, right? As if, again, this dream of unmediated depiction. You can't have that. So anyways, the prologue of Anandamat self-evidently lends itself to an eco-critical reading, and the book as a whole is helpful to consider in light of post-colonialism, obviously. So here are the first lines from the prologue in Lipner's translation. A vast forest. Most of the trees in it are sal, specific. But there are many other kinds of tree. The trees with foliage intertwined stretch out in endless ranks, without break or gaps, without even openings for light to penetrate a boundless ocean of leaves. Interesting, ocean, right? So there's that metaphor. Wave upon wave ruffled by the wind rolls on for mile after mile. Below, profound darkness prevails. Even at high noon, the light is dim, dreadful. Humans never venture into that forest. And except for the ceaseless murmur of the leaves and the cries of its wild beasts and birds, no other sound is heard in it. Sounds like a grim place, right? So, and that's his intent, to paint this initially. Not only is this a vast, profoundly dark forest, but it is also late at night. And it is an extremely dark night, dark even outside the forest. Nothing is visible. And the mass of gloom within it like the darkness in the very bowels of the earth. The birds and animals are completely silent. How many countless millions of animals, birds, worms, and insects live in that forest, yet not one makes the slightest sound. Indeed, the darkness of which we speak could be imagined, but that brooding silence of an otherwise clamorous world is beyond conceiving. In that boundless forest, then, in that impenetrably dark night, in the inconceivable silence, a voice was heard. Remember that idea of the voice I mentioned in the forest? It's kind of disembodied voice. Will my heart's desire never be fulfilled? And the voice heard once more that mighty forest was plunged in silence. What I find fascinating is, again, you have the combination of a kind of mythic or mystical or religious, whatever term you want to use, forest, because in some ways that invokes the tropes of even for example, fairy tale forests, right? In the dark of the night, right? At the same time, though, he mentions sal, right? Specific trees. And then as we know, as we go on, this is just the prologue, because as we go on, we know that then he's going to use a very literal historical event, the famine of the late 1770s, to in which to set this novel. So I think what we have here, and I'm relying on scholars, of course, but I also read it this way, is we have a very challenging, it's very tough to do this, very difficult, which is that he wants to give a mythic, epic feel to a story that is also very particularized, very historicized. Does that make sense? So it's an actual event, but on the other hand, he wants to make it a national epic. If that makes sense. Now, remember we talked about Fenimore Cooper, who's the lesser writer, but nonetheless, Fenimore Cooper from The Last of the Mohicans, he was sort of trying to do the same thing. Not as, he wasn't as great a writer, but it's sort of this idea of making a national epic, but trying to make it real at the same time. That's very hard. That's because you're in the modern period, and history is key to the nation, but so is the myth of the nation. And I don't mean myth in a false sense. I'm not using it that way. I mean, in a healthy way, a mythic vision of the nation. So I make one argument, and it's in my book on the forest. I'll just give you a taste of it, which is that I'm not sure if this is how convincing this is, but this is what I saw. I happened to be reading an epic called The Lusiads, which is by Camões, Luis Vaz de Camões, who spent 3 years in Goa. And he makes a national, it was a side interest, and I was reading a biography of Vasco da Gama, who was kind of obviously a rogue. And but Camões, who, as I said, he was a few generations later. He was in Goa in the 1560s or something like that. And he was trying to make his way. He was impoverished and this and that. But he wrote this, what is today Portugal's national epic, which is a mythifying Vasco da Gama. When I had to make a pilgrimage to Lisbon. No, I'm joking. It was a secular pilgrimage to see the tomb of Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama's over here, and who is buried right here in a big monument? Camões. These are the two national figures, in some ways, for modern Portugal. Now, Portugal has ties to India. Here's where we get those ties that bind from Goa days, right? And so, the Lusiads was probably known. It influenced Milton's Paradise Lost. Not necessarily that he's making a national epic, though some have argued that with Paradise Lost, but more that he finds a way to combine sort of a mythic, secular ethos. So even Camões is not I'm sorry to go on so much, but when Vasco da Gama came He was sent by a king, Manuel, who was very religious, right? Camões is not that, nor is, am I saying, Milton. But it's interesting to see these ties because then Milton influences the Indian readers in India because of the British. So you see these sort of lineages. Now, how is this, what does this have to do with eco-criticism? Well, without going into detail, I can this 1572 Portuguese epic, which again has a great translation a few years ago by Landig White, who it mentions the Spice Islands, it mentions all of these, the Indies. It mentions a time, and this is written in 1572, right? So it mentions a time when you get a whole kind of global sensibility. But what the takeaway here, that I have to speak louder. The takeaway here is that he combines, this was a model, I argue, for combining history and myth, or mythifying history, right? Which a lot of nations, if you look at their national epics, whatever it is, a novel. By the way, for example, for the Philippines, it's a novel in Spanish because of Spanish colonial rule by Jose Rizal. No le mi tangere. So this idea of a Spanish novel, but again, Philippines was many languages, right? So, you know, but the reason I mention that is because a novel from the 1880s can be an epic, a national epic, if you will. So I don't mean you have to write an actual poetic epic. And I think that's what Ananda Math is trying to do. So there are other examples in the late 19th century from around the world. Or from Cuba, you have the Martí, the famous writer Martí, who in around 1900, you know, is a voice for Cuba. I'm just giving you examples. That this was a time that the national spirits of different colonized places was being voiced in this way. Bunkim found the combination of I'm reading from my notes, romanticism, history, and national myth-making irresistible. He admired, quote, Western historical writings, and I'm quoting from Tapan Ray Chaudhuri, because he recognized that a memory of past glory was an essential component of a nation's greatness. A memory of past glory. Now, often that past glory is couched in natural imagery. Why should that be? Because again, this may be tradition, but it's also this idea of trying to evoke a sense of place, even if it's just pure imagination, right? He excitedly read Scott's Waverley novels, Ray Chaudhuri tells us, and other historical romances, and knew his Paradise Lost, though he complained of Milton's unconvincing characters. At the same time, he understood the self-serving nature of these subjective histories. And though his writings are justly famous for brilliantly satirizing both colonial practices and Indian babus who imitated English mannerisms, he was also a bureaucrat, right? He earned his living, after all, as a bureaucrat in this establishment, and believed that science and infrastructure were as important for a modern nation as an intimate knowledge of Indian literatures and history. So that is Tapan Ray Chaudhuri's sort of summation. So it seems likely that one reason the Portuguese poet Camões in the Lusíads chose to focus on someone like da Gama. So you've said, well, why did he focus on da Gama, right? Was because he, the poet, felt a connection to the mariner as a result of their knowledge of Portuguese India. However, in Ananda Math, a historical epic romance evoking patriotic emotions, Bunkim chooses not to turn necessarily to one historical individual, that's the difference, That's how he's distinctly different, right? It's not an individual he turns to. He turns to a sense of place in the forest. And the forest, again, as on the one hand literal, on the other hand mythic. So, and if you, the novel, it's clear when you read that. I read the prologue, and you can, and some of you who read Bengali could tell us more. But this idea that it's very clear that you sometimes uses tropes. For example, the idea of the from Kalidasa we have again I'm relying on scholars. The idea of the creeper, the vine, is very symbolic of women and beauty, right? That comes into play here. It also comes into play in some of the 19th century poetry by Toru Dutt and others. So on the one hand, you have these tropes, romantic tropes, Indian romantic tropes. On the other hand, you also have, as I said, a sense of historicity. So these historical narrative and critical contexts are essential if we're to understand not only Bankim's influential critique of European modernity, whose textual mode made Da Gama, but also why Bankim's choice of forest setting is especially suited to the righteous, potentially successful rebellion, which Shodipto Kaviraj calls its non-actualized possibility that he imagines. So the idea of imaginative possibility is powerful for all would-be nations. They cannot express, right, the revolution hasn't happened, and you're being censored. You know what they did to Jose Rizal? And I saw this in Manila, the place where he was hanged for writing a novel in 1896, 2 years before, ironically, the Spanish were defeated by the Americans. So he was hanged, but now he's a hero to the Filipinos. So if you step too far, you're going to be silenced. But luckily, Rizal had already written these books, which are still read sometimes now in Filipino Tagalog translation, and English. As Bankim's use of counterfacts indicates, so counterfacts meaning it's an imaginative way of talking about an actual historical event, but having poetic license with the facts, right? To say, for example, we have a genre that I'm not well versed with. My son reads some of these, which is speculative historical fiction. So there's one which was, what if the British were defeated in 1858? You know, what would have happened? The hinges of history. So those possibilities in a colonial context are powerful. They can inspire people. He also, I have more here where he also is responding to people like a guy named W.W. Hunter's Annals of Rural Bengal, which is still cited sometimes, but it was authoritative in some ways, but it was still very European. So he's kind of responding to that. But let me just come to some of these key points. I'm sorry, we have what time till what time? Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks. We see a prime example of how Bengal's forests function in Anandamath when the thousands of Santans gather, quote, in a great recess of the immense forest. I think most of you know the premise of the novel, which is that there's a famine caused by the British, which was true, and there's a kind of holy rebellion of sort of these ascetic men who retreat to the ashram of the forest. They also invoke Mother India. That's the famous aspect of this. And they then actually attack these British troops, right? Pretty daring given the context, but that's why he had to set it 100 years earlier. So So they're in the forest. This is a forest, and the monk is named Satyananda, and so forth. This is a forest enlivened by the mango and the jackfruit, by palmyras, tamarinds, and peepals, by the wood apple, banyan, silk cotton, and other trees. That's a quote from the novel, so very much making consciously evoking the actual forest trees. The naming of trees is a significant. Lipner, the translator, rightly observes that the santans, as you know, these sannyasi type holy men, enter the forest, quote, as individual householders or men of the world, and are transmuted into a higher order of celibates, unquote. So then you have a lot of problematic issues of, which has been talked about a lot, celibate men in the service of a maternal figure. So we can see how a feminist reading might unpack that, deconstruct that. He talks about what Lipner says is interesting here. He can make these. He talks about the liminal aspect of the forest. So the forest being an in-between space. There's also something which Lipner discusses, I won't go into, not for time, which is the forest as womb, as a kind of incubator of where people can then get in touch with the authenticity of India and so forth. But it's also a liminal space which a threshold space that rejects the structure of everyday urban or societal existence, right? This is enabled, says Lipner, because of the amorphous setting of the forest. So on the one hand, he names all these trees, but he never names a specific forest, which hasn't stopped scholars from trying to pinpoint it. And he wants to give it a kind of, again, a mystique, a kind of spiritual, a mystical aspect. While it is true that Bunkim frequently paints the forest in this manner, the specific trees he lists in the scene described here can hardly be termed nebulous. They can hardly be so if they are to fill the Santans with the fighting spirit needed to face British cannons. So the naming of trees particularizes this forested homeland in certain ways, conveying to his readers a situational authenticity that a very too general description would lose. So here we are a long way from even Toru Dutt, who had written not too long before, but certainly from Derozio, where it's not just sort of a Europeanized forest or totally amorphous, but it is more particularized and yet still has this mystique. The trees here supply the indexical resonance that iconicity, though vital in other contexts, cannot. By iconicity, I just mean an iconic using a tree as an iconic symbol in certain ways, like the casuarina tree. Bunkim drives home this point by instructing the reader to, and here's what he says in the novel. Picture the scene. This is the narrator. The clamorous voices of 10,000 men, the rustle of the foliage swept by a gentle breeze, the soft lapping of the waves against the riverbank, moon, stars, and a white cloud mass in an indigo sky, the verdant forest on the dark earth, the clear river and the white bank, and clusters of flowers in bloom. And every now and then, that cry dear to all, Bande, and he uses the B, right, spelling, Lipner does, Bande Mataram. To illustrate one way of reading Anandamat in the context of colonialism through an eco-critical lens, we can compare the novel's arboreal setting with those mentioned in Camões. And I show that a little bit in my book. So we could compare that if we had time, right? Side by side and see some of that, but not entirely. So he takes it further. I'm going to turn now to my laptop to just make a couple of more notes. couple more notes, and I think, let me just check real quickly. I believe that we are going up through, oh, we still have the home in the world. So environmental degradation is an important backdrop for Anandamat. So here's a even more specific eco-critical aspect, a fact that to my knowledge scholars have not discussed very much. An East India Company edict of 1799 compelled peasants in Bengal and Bihar, quote, to cultivate a specified amount and plot of land and to deliver its entire production unadulterated at the fixed government price to the agent. The company's thirst for new taxable agricultural lands, among which poppy cultivation was a prime revenue maker, meant the removal of more and more forests and the displacement of their inhabitants. Not just forests, but certainly among other landscapes. The nomadic lifestyles of foresters and herders, which had prevailed in large parts of the country, began to come to an end. One scholar has observed that, quote, India as it is commonly conceived, meaning in modern histories, a land of settled arable farming, of caste Hindus, and of specialist agricultural produce, was very much a creation of the early 19th century period. To enforce these changes, the East India Company enlarged and exploited the pre-existing system of landowners, zamindari system, in tandem with pacification raids against tribal groups like the Bhils, who were then, in the words of one contemporary administrator, allotted wastelands and told to farm them. Poorer farmers, seeking to escape the company's punishing taxes, moved up into the hills, I'm quoting from a scholar, or onto poorer soils and cleared forest as they went, contributing to the overall denudation of many regions. The future Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, who was in India, right, the guy who beat Napoleon, who participated in this forced coercion while campaigning in southern India, when, as the 19th century dawned, he drove roads, quote unquote, drove roads through the forests of Malabar and cleared trees to a mile on the other side. Sorry. In addition to opium, cotton and indigo, in addition to opium, cotton and indigo also featured as favorite revenue-generating crops for the company to plant in deforested lands. The resulting immiseration of Indian peasant farmers was exacerbated when European planters, seeing their crops' profitability, began to take over large tracts of land in the early 1800s, as they did with indigo fields, an injustice that was deeply felt, as we know, by Chatterjee or Chattopadhyay and his fellow professional colleagues. One friend, Dinabandhu Mitra, anonymously penned the famous 1860 play Neel Darpan. Did I pronounce that right? Mirror of Indigo, which attacked English planters and championed the Indian peasant farmer. This social and political context illustrates the extent to which British colonialism's profound environmental changes, and there are many studies on this now by historians, Ramchandra Guha, of course, but also many historians on environmental changes wrought by the British, that had their effects and stirred the emotions of the British Bengal intelligentsia. Not surprisingly, Chattopadhyay, who had lauded Neel Darpan, dedicated Anandamat to its author, right? This land, laments a character in Michael Madhusudan Dutt's 1861 translation of the play, was as the kingdom of Rama before indigo was established, but the ignorant fool has become a beggar and famine has come upon the land. And so, again, this idea of the context, which I enjoy looking at, for why a writer would choose such a setting, what they may have had in mind, and from an eco-critical lens and a post-colonial lens, provides, maybe perhaps enriches our understanding of the novel, and why he would be so animated, right, about this. And this is these are some of the examples. So clearly there, and they had to, again, be very careful how they express this. Anandamath is perhaps most famous today for its lyrics to Vande Mataram, which later set to music. In my view, the later removal of the song from the arboreal setting of the novel, and this is my modest contribution, I'm not an expert on Bengali literature, makes it harder to appreciate its classical literary associations. In Bankim's lyrics, the mother, the embodiment of Bengal, and by extension India, is rich in waters, rich in fruit, and cooled by southern airs. The Bengali original, according to Julius Lipner's gloss, more specifically speaks of southern India's western Ghats. I would add that Bankim does not simply use Dakshina, right, meaning south, but rather Malaya, associated with the Ghats, because in ancient Puranas and epics, the name refers to the same mountain range. It also connotes the fragrance of sandalwood, which grows in those hills. So that's interesting, right? So it's appealing to the southern aspect. Now, the argument is that if you take, and Lipner gives a lot of context for the lyrics, but taking it out of the context of the novel is partly problematic. We also know that it's problematic religiously, right, because of denigration of Muslims. And that if you go to the original context. So we mustn't shy away from that. And the same way in which we talked about the erasure by Thoreau and Emerson of indigenous peoples, right? We have to also look by what is omitted in the public, in writing, not just by what is present. And I think if you think of Ranjit Guha's, the subaltern studies historian, talking about the prose of counterinsurgency many years ago, that great essay where he uses literary criticism, right? A lot of historians are to read between the lines, right? Because what is the use of so many words like in English, in the English administrator's language, madness, right? That shows a kind of anxiety about something they can't control. So in the same way, we might read between the lines. We can do that through eco-criticism. This is just modeling one way of doing that. It is not saying that we have to all read Anandamath. I hope that's not what I'm getting across. Another example is, I mentioned the creepers. So here's that example. He talks about people were so hungry that they eat the creepers from the forest. Right? Now, he really does evoke the terrible famine, right, at that time, and we know there were later famines caused by the British, but this echoes Shakuntala, in which the classical Sanskrit image of creeper vines enhances the eponymous heroine's natural beauty and purity, which are embodied by her forest home. The one character here, his words are meant to shock the newcomer. He's trying to introduce Mahendra, this guy named Bhabananda, to this life of this monastery by reminding him of the degradation of Bengal's beauty, figured as feminine. Very typical, right, of the times, not uncommon. The creeper would likely have also reminded readers of Shakuntala's own beauty and of her long-suffering but ultimately successful effort to have King Dushyanta recognize her, thereby uniting forest and court, as has been observed. So a kind of unification of the forest in Shakuntala, but then he revives it in a kind of modern setting, relatively modern. Okay. A couple more lines on Anandamath, then I want to turn to The Home in the World. I mentioned the combining of, just as Bankim combines Sanskrit and colloquial Bengali, he also combines folk belief systems with upper caste Hindu belief systems. So we have, for example, the I keep going over this. We have, for example, Durga, right? So that's more predictable, who representing Shakti and Prakriti and so on. But we also have Banu, which is the forest, whose name tells you is the forest goddess, specifically if you scholars say if you go back, comes from a particular tribal group in Bengal. So all I'm saying is that he's mixing, in the same way he mixes language, he mixes motifs and belief systems in order to be all-encompassing. Now, we said that he has that blind spot, right? He has that in this novel, I mean, which is talking about Mir Jafar and sort of the Muslim denigration. But again, he's contradictory. In other places, he praises some of the Mughals and so forth. So it's a complex. And I'm not well versed enough in the history, in Indian history, to comment on that. But I can say that he is, it seems to me, pretty adept at mixing the vernacular with the upper or established idioms. Maybe we can say that. And that is something that a lot of great writers try to do. Okay. There's also, if I had time, the idea of using bhakti traditions to which were instrumental in that sense. Okay, let's turn finally to the home and the world in the last 10 minutes here. I don't think this novel needs an introduction, 1916 novel, and it's also, of course, been filmed famously by Ray, but writing in 1995, Indrani Mitra, like many scholars, sees it as, quote, useful for an understanding of this momentous political phenomenon in two ways. That is, the movement, independence movement at the time. First, the novel enacts the social anxieties connected to the production of the new Indian woman at the turn of the century. More importantly, it underlines the crucial significance attached to the discourse of sexuality in the negotiation between opposing forms of political action. So we talked about, as Partha Chatterjee has also talked about in The Nation and Its Fragments, this idea of the home and the world, right? That was a key paradigm. And so that is something that Tagore does not come to a resolution about. He lets the reader decide. And this is, again, where the backdrop is the zamindari system, right? The landowning system. For example, Nikhil represents the home in the book's title, Sandeep, the world. As Chatterjee says, he does not comment on Tagore's novel much in his book, but his thesis is that the domain of the home became a site of resistance against the world of colonial politics. But is there a connection to environmental issues? Right? And you may be wondering about that. He famously argued, Tagore did, as we know, for a renewal of ancient Indian sensitivity to the natural environment, including the forest, right? We've talked about that. And he writes eloquently in many works about the vital need for people to sustain and to being in correspondence with local forests, flora and fauna. I mean, as I understand, I have friends who went to Shantiniketan. It's very much, that's part of that holistic learning, right? Now, this novel, appearing at a time when nationals seemed to have to choose between, among, I should say, Gandhian, militant, and other forms of anti-colonial struggle, is more interested in delineating these tensions and less directly concerned with environmental ones. Nonetheless, the critique of feudalism, the zamindari system, compels us to view India's national ideological struggles as being inescapably tied to the materiality of its landscapes. We cannot ignore that actual historical backdrop, right? So I think that's something to keep in mind. Here I have another quote from Roshinka Chowdhury. She seems to be my favorite scholar here. So she's amazing. She's writing on so many things. She reminds us that the apparent paradox that although the novel was not held by Bengali readers to be as great as his other fictional works, such as Gora, it nonetheless began to garner more scholarly attention in the early 2000s. So here's something interesting of it, pedagogically. Why is the home and the world now so taught? Well, one reason perhaps is because English departments teaching post-colonial literature seem to have gravitated to it. But another is that the novel crystallizes a trope prominent in many post-colonial novels of the home and the world, right? I think, in other words, it's not that it's artificially being taught, but it does seem to capture a paradigm that is very important to a post-colonial context. Chowdhury revisits her earlier point that Bengalis have criticized, right, the novel, and she reiterates Tagore's retort that he is neither a historian. Let's see what pages. I hope I still have these pages. Oh, here we are. That he is neither a historian nor a political activist, but is a creator. And I'll close. I just have a couple minutes here. Oh, I still have 5 minutes. Chowdhury nevertheless lauds the volume as a whole for providing, or lauds, yeah, that's right, lauds the novel for providing, she lauds certain recent scholars for providing social and historical context for our reading of the novel, such as Shekhar Bandyopadhyay's essay, Understanding Panchu, a very minor character. Herein is another way then to read between the lines, if you will, or to pick up the subaltern characters, who is the only Dalit figure in the novel, the minor character, to provide insight into caste politics, I'm quoting from his essay, in the East and North Bengal in this period. Airbrushed out of history textbooks, the aspirations of a whole swath of the population is shown to have ignited a resistance to mainstream politics that becomes more significant in this light. And then I'll pick it up down below. Indicative of a catastrophic lacuna in the process of imagining our nation, unquote. This is what this essay argues. The failure to integrate Dalits and Muslims into dominant national agendas spelt doom then at the time. Now, that's one way of criticizing the novel on a sort of socio-political basis, right? So, that takes us more into a post-colonial realm than an eco-critical, understandably. But again, I think implicit in this, just to remind us, is that you can then, as some of these younger scholars have done, accentuate the context of the feudal zamindari system. What's producing this? Remember, I mentioned Edward Said saying in his book, 1993 book, talking about how Jane Austen manners are enabled and produced by slave plantations. A lot of people didn't like that at the time. It was interesting if you go back and read the criticism. Like, you're cheapening, Jane Austen, And that's not his point. He's not saying don't read. He loves Jane Austen, right? Not as a person, but as a writer. So the idea is that in the same way, we can look at a great novel and try to, after all, we're looking at it because it's worth looking at, right? And try to provide a context for it. If you're interested, as you know, perhaps the same applies in a same debate applies to teaching Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, for example, which Achebe famously calls, or he calls Conrad a bloody racist. Rightly so, I think. But on the other hand, do we just dismiss it, right? Altogether. This is a predicament we face with many novels, right? And I don't want to shy away from that. We're not at that level with The Home and the World. Nonetheless, it is a reminder that the ethical impulse of post-colonial critique compels us to look at the blind spots in all writing, right? It has taught us to look not just in post-colonial writing, right? And it can come at a cost where you feel like your favorite author is now no longer. My daughter, she's a lawyer, but she reads a lot, and she says every time she finds out something, she loves films and all, likes Hindi films too. But every time she finds out something bad about the real life celebrity, oh man, now I can't watch that, right? So in the same, it's hard to, and I have students who's, or they'll say, I get this a lot. This is just such grim writing. It's just too tough. Now, admittedly, life is tough, and sometimes you want, but I don't know that we go to college for escapism. So, so in any way, I just want to end by saying that there's also a lot of great critique of middle-class Bengali women's subjectivity at the time. For example, Chaudhary notes, if the Indian woman's selfhood in the first decade of the 20th century needs painful reconstruction from material overwhelmingly written by men, the records in the instance of British women are slightly more substantial, but not by much. Thus, Chaudhary notes as an example how in one essay the tragic inconclusiveness of the ideas of nation and womanhood is foregrounded to show how their visions are inscribed within two kinds of masculinities, as well as different conceptions of freedom. So you could even argue from a feminist standpoint that Sandeep and Nikhil are, they're kind of arguing across the woman they love, right? Which gets close to this idea of triangular love that Sedgwick talks about, but that's another story. And I just want to end by saying that, again, this does not mean that, we can also, by the way, see different versions of Shakti represented in some of these modern women. But we can't shy away from the fact that these are this is a male kind of ethos that's still expressed. Even though at the time we now know from the great volumes like Women Writing in India, that we have women's writing that was happening but was not either published or not judged to be worth reading. Yeah. So, thank you. I'll stop there. That's the end of lecture 2. Yeah, I have to keep track of the time. for day 2, and the title is, again, just a working title, Modern Indian Literature, Survey of Some Recent Voices. And that's exactly what it is. It's a very selective survey because it's hard to capture all of the recent voices. Partly, I also I'm interested in this, obviously, the eco-critical post-colonial voices. So I should have perhaps specified that. So until fairly recently, the most novels labeled post-colonial have been set primarily in cities. Now, there are exceptions. I'm just saying majority. And until recently, that is until maybe 20 years ago. And although these important novels reflect urban sensibilities that align with those of most readers, they obviously leave out the majority of people and spaces, right? Or it could be an urban traveler going to the forest, as we'll see with Gangopadhyay's novel. So it's either an urban setting or an urban sensibility, but they leave this quite a large segment out. Of course, this is true of many works that are not labeled post-colonial, especially in those in languages other than English, which have represented rural areas to some degree. But as I've mentioned, the label post-colonial literature, I think I've mentioned this, is both elastic and limited, so it's broad. And as the nature of this course exemplifies, right? It covers a huge number of possible ways of reading texts. And it was originally the label itself was originally developed by urbanized scholars, writing mostly in the Western Academy, who understandably were on the lookout, if you're talking 30 plus years ago, for non-Western works with clear themes of anti-colonialism, nationalism, and the complex effects of race, gender, and class. That was all very productive. That is, it still is. In the past maybe 15 years, however, healthy debates about these assumptions and even the viability of the term post-colonial have led us to what I believe is a much wider and more discerning way of looking at these texts, of understanding non-European works of literature. Indeed, many English department ads today do not advertise for post-colonial, they advertise for Anglophone literatures. And so it's interesting to see how this has changed, because we have Francophone, we have Lusophone, and so on. But this expands it out. Now, there is a risk of de-emphasizing ethical issues and so on. There's a risk in every label. But, and each label, any label has its problems. It's simply a way of corralling and categorizing what we read. At the same time, such literatures have been productively interpreted through an eco-critical lens, as I've said. So this has added a great deal to pre-existing works, and usually by drawing on an interdisciplinary range of scholarship. So again, we could, to use the example I was using, there are many readings of Things Fall Apart from an eco-critical lens, right? So that was not considered until fairly recently. We can also look at works of fiction like Ghosh's Ibis trilogy, and more broadly, perhaps the Blue Humanities, about the roles that oceans play in global literature. So I'm not touching on that in this talk or in these lectures. And we can reread canonical texts in that way. There is a danger, by the way. I mentioned the pairing, which is very helpful to do for teaching, which is pairing, say, Heart of Darkness with Things Fall Apart, right, as a way to show that. The danger, as David Damrosch has pointed out, is hypercanonicity, sort of the way that, okay, now we're saying these canonical texts are clearly biased, but we're going to keep teaching them because we're comparing them now to another one. So we may keep going back to the Shakespeare, to the Milton, to the practicality is we leave little space for more and more texts that are produced. I don't know how we resolve that. I'm just saying that that's a challenge. In this lecture, I'll review 3 novels that some of you will be more familiar with than me, that deal with non-urban spaces. All of them with forests, by writers whose sensibilities seem less beholden to urban outlooks, even though they are, of course, modern, educated writers. But we're not saying that, but I think that's they have taken us a little bit further away from the classic paradigms of the urban country city milieu. Eastern Inkire, a novel and folklorist from Nagaland, writes fiction in English about her region and culture. This region, of course, composed of many groups and languages distinct from the rest of India, is experiencing an explosion of writing, mostly in English, but not all, with Nagas, Mizos, Apatanis, and so on, tapping into their rich veins of orality, much of it conditioned by their mountainous forested homelands to give written expression to their conflicted identities. This inner conflict is not surprising given the sense of being doubly subjugated by Europeans and then by the Indian state to some degree. I know this is a sensitive topic. I'm just saying that these are the topics that come up in these works. I'm not advocating one way or another, as I tell the camera. Northeastern groups have therefore sought a measure of political autonomy in various ways, but in that healthy way, it's through writing, right? As you know, this has been an exciting area. Kire's 2014 novel, When the River Sleeps, is set entirely in a forest, does not deal with urban context at all, follows the journey of a middle-aged Naga man named Villi, I guess how you pronounce it, who works for India's Forest Department. That's the modern connection, right? We're never told exactly when the story takes place, except that it's in the modern period. We have the Forest Department, we have guns, things like that. And after the advent of Christianity to the region in the 19th century, so somewhere in the 20th century, right? It's worth noting that I think something from one statistic I saw, 88% are Christian in this particular region. But I don't know if that's how accurate that is now, but that was one census. The topographical detail, on the other hand, is richly described. Teak trees, riverine ferns, these are from her novel written in English. Plantain or plantain, depends on how you want to pronounce it, trees. Herbs like bitter wormwood and amaranth. Very specific, right? Villi's fellow Angamis, a clan within the larger Naga tribal group, think he's odd. So again, the complexity, he's not representing all Nagas, obviously. They think he's odd for preferring to live year-round in the forest rather than in a village. He does miss the, quote, ordinary things of village life, but after 25 years at his job, he concludes, the forest is my wife, and perhaps this is what marriage is like. With periods of when a chasm of loneliness separates the partners. I don't know why I'm laughing, but it's interesting to think of that, how he says this. More than anything, he wants to find a sleeping river. This is the title that he first heard about as a boy and which he's been dreaming of ever since. I can't even touch on, and I'm not as astute to read this, but the function of dreams is fascinating in a lot of these works. So he's interested in finding this sleeping river, and the story was more than a story to him. He has always wanted to catch the river when it went to sleep so that he can wrest a stone from the heart and take it home, where the stone will grant you whatever it is empowered to grant you. It could be cattle, women, prowess in war, or success on the hunt. So we have, in one sense, a classic quest motif, right? To find something, remember, mentioned Gilgamesh, we can go back to ancient literature, that seems to be eternally human. To have this quest motif, but in a kind of different setting, of course. One can, in short, make the magic of this heartstone yours, as she writes. Is it possible, he asks himself, that only forest dwellers can understand such things exist in the places not frequented by man? Will the magic of the river work only for a believer? Would it work in spite of lack of faith? So, in subtle ways, we do get a man who is a self-reflecting individual. He's not part of a community very much. That's what's interesting, right? Typically, indigenous stories will accentuate the community. And I think this does, but by producing the opposite, by saying you don't have the community, that's a glaring omission. So conspicuous by what's missing, I think in that way Kire arguably calls attention. She's calling attention to his solitude. And this was one of the problems. To get to the river, Vili will have to trek through different forests, some familiar and some dangerous and unfamiliar. And so he packs his essentials: a hunting knife, tobacco, tea, salt, a gun, and salted venison. And after a 4-hour hike to a settlement of itinerant Nepali woodcutters, again, here you have this modern sort of migratory labor, who are the closest neighbors, he is swallowed up by the trees of the forest. Interesting choice of verbs. He spends the night in an empty shed belonging to another Naga clan. This is still somewhat familiar territory, but in the middle of the night, his hunter ear picks up the softest fall of padded feet. He woke with a start, the hair on his arms standing on end at the knowledge that he was not alone, and then a great paw smashes through the shed's old tin and weak wood, as she writes. And as Vili runs to the door, quote, a tiger came at him fearlessly, throwing itself at the outline of the man. Vili sidestepped the beast, which crashed into the door, breaking it and leaving torn fragments of wood hanging on its hinges. He shot off a bullet, and in the flash, he saw that the tiger was much bigger than any he had ever seen. At this moment, you might think this is a Gothic adventure story, but it's not, right? The tiger returns, and Vili now understands that this is in English, were-tiger, W-E-R-E, right? Like a werewolf. It's a were-tiger. Since ordinary tigers kept their distance from man, this one was coming back for more, unafraid of the gun. And Vili, is trying to think of names of men in the region who knew the art of transforming their spirits into tigers. So again, this is not uncommon anthropologically or culturally. Throughout the world, you have Native American lore as well. You can have shapeshifters or people who either can shift their shape or change their shape at will, or they are stuck in a different form. But again, what it does is it shows the close connection of the human world to the blurred boundaries, right? At least that's what anthropologists will say. That sort of liminal aspect, whether you believe it or not. And of course, you would say that she presents it as if it's real, right? Just as Achebe presents, the priestess and the oracle in Things Fall Apart as real. We're not to judge this on an empirical basis, right? That's not the point, as would have been done in past times, right? Maybe a few decades ago. Why are you treating me as a stranger, he cries. I come in peace. You owe me your hospitality. I'm your guest. He shouted these words out with absolute faith that they were being listened to and heeded Sure enough, the animal retreated for the second time, but not before it had made a call like a warrior's ululating cry. So not words, but not a tiger's call either. Vili recalls the words of his village seer who had told him years ago that to find the sleeping river, he would sometimes have to struggle against spiritual powers that no gun could stop. So you might say, well, maybe this is a fable, right? An allegory, perhaps. But that's not indicated in the text. And I think that's shrewd on the part of Kire. She's not saying this is just a story to really make a point about the reality. This is his reality. So whether you believe it or not, right? And so I think that's another interesting area that I found. I've been doing work on pilgrimage, and it's interesting to see how different belief systems function, and how I think Amitav Ghosh portrays this in The Hungry Tide, as I mentioned the other day, to push that sense of empirical fact, right, to its limit, right? Not in the, I could go off and I better stop, but with Franz Kafka and the Metamorphosis and so forth. But animal studies talks about this a lot. We talked about animals, people. But these, I think, are still very much in a kind of urban said ethos, where there's a kind of knowingness to the narrator. Here, I don't have that feeling. And it's hard to know, and I think that's her intention. It's hard for for us, we get a bit disoriented there. And I think that's her intention, right? It's kind of alien. What are the references? Is there a reality here, right? The next day, Vili hikes. I better watch how much time I have. Okay. He hikes. His hike takes him to the Nettle Forest, capitalized, an area avoided by his clan and frequented by another. That's another common reality that a lot of groups who live with forests they'll have sacred groves on the one hand, as Madhav Gadgil and Ramchandra Guha have talked about. On the other hand, which are only secret as well to them. On the other hand, they will avoid certain forests, like the evil forest in Things Fall Apart. So, again, it's interesting where he says, he reached the Nettle Forest, he saw three figures ahead and became tense, wondering if the seemingly real sight, that's her words, would metamorphose into something else. Now he's on edge because, right, are they going to change into were-tigers or something? But then he says he's relieved to find that they are women from a friendly border village of another clan who are harvesting nettle to make yarn. He finds it refreshing to meet real people and have a normal conversation. So he's a solitary guy, but now he's venturing into a forest realm he's unfamiliar with. He and the other women of the group reminisce about past times when their two clans bartered with each other and knew one another's tongues. Sad that the younger ones haven't learned other languages, Vili says. Trying his hand at pulling out the nettles, he's immediately stung. Damn, he exclaims, that was more painful than the nettle we have in our village. It's stronger than the species found in your area, says the woman. It yields better yarn, but it stings harder too. So you have this sort of ordinary, non-urban setting. So now you have a people who experience it differently and just matter-of-factly, right? Hey, I don't know. I didn't know about this. So I think that's really interesting. I think she suggests several interrelated topics that are important. So in this forest that's far removed from modern life, it makes sense that he's worried about what is real and what is not. My interest here is in the Northeast Indian setting of this phenomenon where forests are rapidly disappearing. And as we know, she does not talk about that explicitly, right? And as we know, when a people's forests disappear, their belief systems tend to as well. And indigenous people like the Naga, to use the broad term, don't simply live within a forest, they think it, right? To use Cohn's word. The novel's particular narrative mode similarly reconnects us to questions about language. presented in an orthographic and material medium, an English language novel, that many Nagas who live in this setting may not have access to. Maybe not many, but some. We may wonder how the novel reshapes folk stories expressing the overlap between biological and spirit worlds. Right? Does this presentation, in other words, package regional identities in ways that make them more amenable to an urban readership? Or how does its forest regionalism echo or contrast with expressions of national identity that we've talked about? For instance, the story about forest spirits intersects in interesting ways with Mahashweta Devi's stories and others. And for one thing, the readers will immediately note the conspicuous absence of history in the novel. Now, this raises another issue because a lot of post-colonial scholars and a lot of novels, fiction and poetry, will accentuate the fact that a lot of indigenous peoples, the way they were kind of pushed out of the realm of agency was to dehistoricize them and think of them as timeless, right? They're just there to be like the noble savage, right? But that dehumanizes them. It doesn't give them any agency. So this would seem at first to be a problem. That is to say, if there's no history here, there aren't any references that we habitually are used to. Where are we, right? And so on. It would seem to be a problem. And I think Kirei perhaps is forcing us to think about, perhaps one could argue, I'm just speculating, that to say that, yes, that is a problem when you portray indigenous peoples as timeless and objectify them. On the other hand, is the capital H history necessary for everyone, right? Or can we say, do certain local peoples have their own sense of what history means? It is a creation, after all, right? So I think it raises more questions. I'm thinking of, well, let me read this. Predation, so being a predator, is a key motif in this novel, as it is in other forest fictions, but not in the conventional senses of either the hunting of animals or the predatory exploitation of forests by outsiders. The narrative could be characterized as expressing an ecology of cells or a relational system of being, as Eduardo Kohn says, in which the question of who is predator and who is prey, becomes complicated. Not only is Vili preyed upon by other men, because there are some altercations that happen, and not only does he hunt animals for food, but he is attacked by were-tigers and other spirit beings. But if the relationships in these cases are contextually dependent, is it accurate to describe them as predatory? Unlike, say, Mary Orang, whom we'll encounter in Mahashweta Devi's The Hunt, Vili's understanding of human-animal spirits is part of his social imaginary rather than an intrusion by outsiders. So this predation is not something that comes from without. It's in the forest. That inverts the typical paradigm. I'm getting a little philosophical here, but the point is, I think she's trying to shift our paradigms. That's all. You will have to gauge whether you agree, you feel that's successful or not. Kirei's text, I suggest, resists our conventional literary and sociological expectations by disconnecting its realist tropes, so realistic fiction, from their expected signifiers, and by providing scenes that read as subtle critiques of interpretation, typical interpretation. One example is when Vili happens to witness a man's murder by two Nagas who are not part of his clan village, and then becomes their prey. So he witnesses it, they know he's witnessed it, now they're going to go after him. Captured and accused of being a threat to the men's clan, he's brought before the village elder. He is saved by coincidence. The elder remembers meeting him long before and is favorably inclined. The man points to the burn mark of a bullet that grazed Vili's skin as proof that he not the other two men, is the hunted rather than the hunter. Vili is deemed innocent and freed and carries on in his quest. So, interestingly enough, I think whereas novelists like, say, Raja Rao or Amitav Ghosh can rely on their Indian readers' familiarity with village tropes, I'm thinking of Kantapura and other things. In other words, you can rely on familiar tropes, right? So we can also rely, if we're reading, arguably, if you're reading Anandamath, you can rely on the trope of the creepers of the classical connection, right? But here, again, the average reader in English here in urban metropolitan areas doesn't have that reference. So what do? Quiré's readers are thrust into a region that usually appears in mainstream media as a space of either natural wildness or insurgency or something else, right? So this is just a place that it is what it is. And I think we're thrust into that in order to sort of make us disoriented and then question our own assumptions. So I'm going to stop there. I think there's so much more one could speculate in this, but it's an interesting novel. It's, again, it's almost fable-like, but it's not. And so you see what you think of it. We'll move now to Temsulo Ao, whose select poems we'll look at just briefly. And again, Naga, and as you know, a late professor and activist, very well known. And I would say, kind of like Mahashweta Devi, kind of equally well known for activism as for writing. Right. In this first poem, I'll just read snippets of Soul Bird. She writes, "They are chanting prayers, but I watch a lonely hawk soaring amidst the swirling blue. Wings darken the whiteness of the rushing clouds. It moves in hesitant circles, emitting an unearthly sound. Hawkeyes seemingly riveted on the mound below, fenced in by newly cut bamboo. The mourners depart from this obscure bit of disturbed earth. But grandmother clings to the new-made barrier guarding the fresh mound, but grandmother clings to the new-made barrier guarding the fresh mound." Repetition, right? "Until her grieving heart senses a presence hovering in the sky, she turned her gaze, red-rimmed eyes settled on the circling silhouette, and then with a sudden, unseemly whoop, she draws me closer, whispering in my ear, 'See that keening bird in the sky? That's your mother's soul saying her final goodbye. It is over. Come, let us go home now.'" Nice. This is a different genre. But it's also not thrusting us into the unfamiliarity of a forest, but perhaps, I wouldn't say unfamiliarity, but invoking the blurred boundaries of nature and self, perhaps, to some degree. The connection to nature, maybe most obviously. Also, there's the opposition of pronouns like I and then they or you. What does that mean? They are chanting prayers, but I watch a lonely hawk, right? There are also connections of geography, the earth, right? And connections to the disturbed earth, and then can also invoke through memory, right? The idea of the grandmother, remembering this. Perhaps you could read this, and I'm thinking of these other poems I assigned as well, as saying, first of all, the importance of storytelling, right? As in many indigenous cultures, because of the more emphasis on orality. And it can happen, it doesn't have to be in indigenous cultures, it can be for anyone. But this idea of, remember I said we might have to question what history is in Quiré's novel. So here I think perhaps history are the memories of your forebears and your own grandparents and your parents. I mean, after all, what is history? When the if you look at the history of the novel, it's interesting to see how many in the 1700s were called the true history of Moll Flanders, or the history of Daniel Defoe, because we have sort of accentuated those categories, but the history was just the story of a life, right? Or as feminists have said, it's his story, not her story, but it's a story of a life. And so we ourselves, even in modern sense, may have sort of narrowed that purview of what history is, right? And I think Dipesh Chakrabarti, by looking at poetry, for example, and Ranjit Guha, are trying to find some way of an alternate view of history, even as they grapple with modern history. So with these poems, I think it's almost song-like. I think at times it's reflective. Let me just read a couple more. I'll just read one more poem. Heaven and Earth. Empty words these, vaunted designations without locations and avowed destinations without roadmaps. No geography is theirs to claim or history to affirm. Only clever innuendos that play on gullible minds. Heaven for me is where my heart throbs, and earth that climb where it ought to thrive. But heaven, you say, is where earth is not, because you insist they do not belong. So then, who identifies the space and apportions the time for the mislocated heaven and earth? Is it geography or history, or the same old word vendors spewing more sophistry to harass and hound befuddled wayfarers like you and me seeking heaven on a vacuous earth? So who are the arbiters, the gatekeepers of geography, what the meaning of geography is, of history? And we know there's a lot of critique, healthy self-critique among scholars about, as anthropologists, I think, were the first modern disciplines to do in the 1980s, to start saying, maybe we should anthropologize ourselves, as James Clifford has done. So if you look at this, I think she's, and I know it's hard to, when you're just hearing it, it's something worth rereading. One thing she's critiquing is the fact that no one can claim geography, right? This is again an anti-colonial. It's even an anti-nation state in the modern sense. It also talks about the fact that it's anti-romantic. It's anti-romantic in the sense of not wanting to say that heaven is this, right? It's not like my pure homeland, right? It is, and so then who identifies the space and apportions the time for the mislocated heaven and earth? And I think that's a profound statement. And this reminds me too of what I mentioned the other day, yesterday, Brian Friel's 1980 play Translations Again, which is this idea of cartography and naming and so forth. And I think she's calling us. The other part of this is, I like her phrase, befuddled wayfarers like you and me. So that could be, oh yes, that's life and all. But on the other hand, it's hard to do without GPS. Can we do without clocks? We fetishize the clock and the phone. So I think in that sense, we can all relate to it. On another level, it's about dispossession, right? It's about taking agency away from the people who live there. And so it's a critique of the nation state, but it's also a critique of any kind of dominant system, So you can read it on different ways. She also has a wonderful story about, poem called Legacy, about birthing. And you can read this idea. It's a real birth, very, very earthy, but it's also says that, the child has to be, you're a fighter from the start, and has to be put in a sterile room. So perhaps based on her own birth. But then you can read birth as poetry, right? Birth as kind of entering the world, and you don't know what's going to become of it, right? So I think that's interesting. She has a final one that I assigned called Wood Smoke, and just talks about ordinary evenings in a hut with a few shrimps, a handful of rice, and wild herbs. She talks about hunger or hungry evenings. So there's hunger, but there's also the idea of nature as sustainer. So that's how I read it. I'll just end this by saying Ao famously advocated for a more authentic, less stereotyped understanding of Naga and Northeastern cultures, which, as she has noted, is different from those that also inhabit Northeast India. So we can't just put them all together, but nonetheless, she has been read in that sense. In a survey course, you could say that Ao's work, like ours, right? Ao's work can serve as a reminder of the rich explosion of literary works from this region, and also it reflects her aim of presenting the full range of Naga cultures to a broad audience. Her choice of English, after all, is important. Even though she was fluent in several other languages, point to her aim of reaching in such an audience. One scholar nicely summarizes her body of work as one that interrogates the frictions between identity, boundaries, and globalization. The bulk of her writing is personal, inflected with stories of her childhood and anecdotes from her life, biography, annals, and memoir. And I think this idea of reaching for sometimes hybrid text, we're going to encounter that with an early century-old African-American text tomorrow, trying to access all kinds of different writing media, different genres, refusing to be saying that this is what a novel is, right? This is what a poem has to do, which is, let's face it, we are all constrained by that, right? Sometimes. So it's very hard to break from that. We have still some time. Good. We have Kaveri Nambisan, The Scent of Pepper. And as I said, I went to Kurg, not for this, because of this. I just, by myself, my first time I got a little grant, small grant to go to, I was already in India, so I got a small grant to study forest. I said, well, I better just have to do the tough job of going to a forest retreat. Someone has to do it. So I did that, and it was very beautiful. And it's interesting how the Kodagus or the Kurgis are so different, right, in many ways. But so I'm not talking loud enough, but so are a lot of groups, right? And I think every group has those identities, but it is really interesting. So she narrates the multi-generational story. I'm just going to introduce this briefly. Story of the Kalyanda family, Kodava family of the forested Kodagu region, who are proud descendants of warriors who became owners of pepper and coffee estates. Their success attracts the jealous eyes of other estate owners, and the novel, which at times is an homage to the Kodava past, presents us with colorful family members, especially many strong and vibrant women. The storyline follows these three generations during times of momentous change in 20th century India, changes in profession, modernization, environment. The effects of these changes are especially hard on the men in the family whose past warrior fame is less appreciated than before, and who are sometimes overtaken by despair. These features mean that the novel fits well, perhaps, within the broad rubric of post-colonial eco-criticism. One of the male members, Subu, captures the ennui or the chronic boredom, aimlessness that he and his peers are experiencing when he says sophistication was a shell. You were what you were, children of Tadiyandamulu, I don't know if I'm pronouncing these right, Malitirani and Brahmagiri, with a kernel of honor and helplessness, fearlessness, born to care for the land made sacred by the goddess and protector of Kodagu. So their own system. The matriarch is the widow Nanji, who we are told has made her family house the sacred system of nobility, and who more than anyone was to make it the strongest fortress of the Kalianda clan. I'll end with a snippet, a paragraph from her to give you a sense of her style, and then we'll move to the last novel. So this describes the land, because talking about the eco-critical aspect, which Nanji herself has discerned is ideal for growing pepper. So she's the one who realizes, hey, we can grow pepper, right? It was Nanji's friendly, inquisitive nature that had led her to the discovery that the climate was ideal for growing pepper. By questioning the Mapla, the Muslim men, she found that what pepper needed was a long spell of monsoon, fairly warm temperature for a few months, and a good amount of shade. Like many of her neighbors, she had already experimented with a few vines that she planted around the mango trees near the house, and they produced just enough pepper to use with fried pork. They do like pork, I found out. No one in Kodagu had thought of cultivating pepper in a big way until Nanji thought it was worth trying. So anyway, she discovers that it's not only the red berries that are lucrative, other parts of the plant have many uses, quote unquote, as carminative, digestive, and when mixed with honey to soothe sore throats that were common among the young ones during the monsoons. Now, Kaveri Nambisan is also a surgeon. So she brings sometimes the ideas of illness and recuperation are from her own experience. She serves the poor there in this area generally. So again, strong women who are creating what they can out of and sustainably creating a productive environment based on what they have before them. Because sadly, you can see how change has, in the novel at least, how change has made the men kind of a little more despairing relatively. Did I lose something here? Oh, Sarah Joseph. Now we come to the last novel, just enough time, I think. A Gift in Green, apparently written at the same time in English, that is published in the same year, in English and Malayalam. So she writes in bilingually. I think that's interesting if we're talking about the language issue, right? It focuses on a Dalit community called Pulaya, who live in the village of Ati in Kerala. It's obviously a fictional village, who are initially shown to live in balance with their forested habitat. Their covenant with the area's water and with the larger environment sustains them both physically and culturally. But then a past member of the village called Kumaran returns with his ambitious plans to develop the area. Classic story, right? Partly by duping the villagers, he ushers in a voracious modern worldview that seeks the area's lucrative minerals and that brings with it both pollutants and germs. As Joseph puts it, this outside infusion of greed and modernity, and here's the quote, fattened itself with an insatiable metallic chomping, like a patient whose hunger aggravated the more he ingested. It chomped up everything in its gigantic mouth, snapped up and swallowed hills, forests, rivers, paddy fields, marshes, and excreted townships. Makes me wonder where I live. So, but hard. It's very critical, hard-hitting, and that's her intention, right? The phrase metallic chomping reminded me of a snippet I might show either tomorrow or maybe the last day of a famous BBC video from about 15 years ago of something called the lyrebird, L-Y-R-E. You may have seen this video, which imitates the sounds, anything it hears, and what it hears is a chainsaw in the forest of Brazil. Tragic, right? A brilliant video, and it sounds exactly like a chainsaw. That's its new reality, right? And pretty soon it won't be able to do that because its habitat will be gone. Now I'm just going to read a little bit from a sort of contextualize all of this by some notes I have made, and hopefully this touches on all these novels in some way. So this comes a bit from my current research, so I hope it fits in. Anthropologist GIAN Shinde, echoing others, has observed that the dialectic between the place and its story is central to the understanding of landscape. So others have made the same observation. Without story, there is no place, if you think about it. A place is meaningful to someone or some group. It has to be made meaningful through its myths and stories and so on, folk tales. If there is no story, if there's no one to tell those stories anymore, it loses that value, as, for example, we can see all over the world, right? In America, it's gobbles up all kinds of lands, or we have the Andaman Islands and so on. So this is a story replicated everywhere. So if those people are erased or displaced, then, or their story subdued, silenced, you don't have to compete with that, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. David Sofer, the late cultural geographer, said that the message of place is compounded of both the myth of the place and the direct experience of it. That's another part of it. So in other words, without story, there's no place, and stories about place are therefore part of what scholars sometimes term traditional ecological knowledge, right? Which, for example, Gadgil and Guha noted 3 decades ago, is indispensable for the preservation of endangered ecosystems. You cannot preserve, it's very hard to preserve ecosystems, let's put it this way. And I'm not an ecologist, I'm relying on them. It's hard to preserve ecosystems without the aid of the people who live there. If those people are not there, it's even more, it's very difficult. Just as we know that ethnobiologists will tell us that the storehouse of knowledge, like in the Amazon, for medicinal plants is rapidly diminishing. Pretty soon we'll lose a lot of that knowledge, right? Both because we've cut the trees down and we've displaced the people. So, as I think was said in the first day by Dr. Mahesh, was that it, professor who was here? He's an environmental engineer. You can't do environmental engineering without talking to people who are going to be affected by that, right? And that was the problem of so much, not just colonialism, but neocolonialism and World Bank aid and all that stuff. So if you're interested, Rob Nixon, among others, is very eloquent on this topic. In Gift of Green, Joseph accentuates the importance of storytelling for indigenous communities in several ways, including by interspersing her novel with sections she calls storytelling nights. So suddenly you'll have remember I talked about trying to, I'm not sure if this works, and I'm just testing this out. Maybe this is part of that approach that's refusing to follow the typical linear novel fashion. Now, there are many other experiments with the novel. I don't mean obviously, right? And Garcia Marquez and all these people. But I think to consciously intersperse, suddenly have storytelling, a night of a story, is fascinating, right? In a modern context. Because this is about modern toxins. Remember we talked about toxic discourse, and I think this works into there. Gadgil and Guha have argued about sorting people into groups that they call omnivores, ecosystem people, and ecological refugees. Omnivores are us. We have access to all kinds of foods. right? Doesn't mean we eat them all. We just have access. Ecosystem people are living more or less off the land. That's still the majority of the world and the planet. Ecological refugees are the lowest in the rung, who have been displaced for one reason or another. Either because someone's building a dam, or because their habitat has been cut down, or because of climate change, perhaps. So I think it's useful to keep, I was relying on another essay on this actually, but for this use of Gadgil and Guhu, but in pertaining to Joseph, but I think it's useful to keep this in mind because it fits well with the reading of the novel. In Joseph's novel, as one critic points out, storytellers have pride of place in the local community. Thus, here's a snippet from the novel. Putting down their bundles, the storytellers, capital S, who came year after year, would take a dip in the cool water of Ati. This is the fictional village. Emerging from the water, they would clad themselves in white. The Karnavar, I guess, of Ati would then, is that right? Elder. Yeah, elder, thank you. Would then lead the storyteller, capital S, by the hand into the boat and make him sit on the prow. The ceremonial boat would be anchored in the ferry bank, on the ferry bank that stretched like the neck of a bottle into the courtyard of Tampuran's shrine. Even as the storyteller took his appointed place on the prow of the boat, the introducer would arrive from the east rowing his boat. In faithful compliance with the traditions of Ati, the introducer, wearing a headgear and mask, a torch blazing in his hand, would step into the water. So this idea of storytelling and ritual, right? That's what's key here. Now, this is before the intrusion of the outside. So now we also have the idea of, remember we talked about Rachel Carson as the Fable for Tomorrow, A Fable for Tomorrow, intentionally dramatizing the idea of, oh, we have this idyllic place, and suddenly, so there's something of that here, right, to shock us into an awareness of, maybe, of what's happening. I'm thinking of also the community stories are also syncretistic. They're syncretic, whichever way you want to spell that. They are a mix of different traditions. It's kind of like the Bon Bibi myth, which I was fortunate enough to go to the Sundarbans, and you see the Bon Bibi in different areas, a lot of places, that Amitav Ghosh talks about in The Hungry Tide. And that's about, it's Arab Muslim, it's folk Hindu, it's interesting melange of, it's syncretistic, it's classic folk, right? By folk, I mean non-dominant, right? In the same way, as one critic notes, one reader notes, Joseph's novel reflects this by borrowing from Hindu, Muslim, and Christian narratives. So its intent, now, that can also, this hybrid, sort of Creole, if you will, narrative, also reflects the hybridity of the environment, right? And this hybridity is what's threatened by a kind of monolithic, narrow tunnel view of what development means. Right. And I'll end with this. I think we just have, yes, just right. So this Arcadian setting, she presents at the beginning of the novel, is shattered by the arrival of outside polluters. So one character describes it this way, one of the village characters. I'm afraid to look into the water now, can't see through to the bottom at all. The very feel of it has changed. I've given up searching among the roots and hollows of the mangrove trees. Where have all the prawns gone? The roots are crushed by the concrete piles driven among them. Gag your mouth and nose for a few minutes and see for yourself. Wouldn't you die? The little mangrove trees have started dying from their roots up. The prawns and karimin have gone elsewhere looking for safe places to breed. Bridges should not be built where they breed. That will be the end of fishing. So her characterization of toxicity and pollution is also illustrated by these lines. But all of this belonged to the distant past that had vanished without a trace. So again, reflecting on now, recollecting what had been, that's the fictional conceit. Now the same grass lay coagulated in thick, pitchy sludge. Unable to sit or even stand on it, the people were sorely distressed. The water itself lay black and gluey, and on its surface lingered malodorous bubbles. Marcos felt nauseated at the thought of stepping into that water. Contrary to custom, the storyteller had had his bath in a lotus pond somewhere else before coming here. So it's too polluted even for stories. In a sense, stories are then becoming polluted, right? By extension. So just to sum up what we've been talking about today then, if I can, I'm not sure I can sum it up, but in the 19th century, colonially educated writers are searching for ways of expressing their national longing in terms of a modern state. This is evolving, so it's not static. And, we have the benefit of hindsight, right? We always do when we read backwards like that. When you're in the middle of it, you can't see it. Like today, it'd be interesting to read 20 years from now what was happening in 2025 that we did not see, right? So I think the takeaway is that they were searching for different ways of expressing, we might call them different idioms, in which to express both a modern state and an Indian ethos. So European romantic tropes coalesce with classical Indian tropes in this effort, right, to talk about a homeland. Today, as again, I'm sort of summarizing here, in Northeast Indian writers are doing the same, right? That has not ended. That is still continuing. So that's a reminder that it is not in the past, right? That these efforts still are happening, as they are with Native American writers, for example. As we'll see in another lecture, we're going to look at some more novels. And I think that these are the takeaway then when I said that this was part of, what did I call this? The survey of some recent voices. It's just a touch, right? And I too, I can't keep up with all the writing. It's wonderful writing coming out. So I think as one thing you could do then is, get even a deeper grasp of all these wonderful writings that are coming out that do succeed in alerting us to this slow violence that's occurring in the world today, which is so hard to see at times. So I'm not sure if we reached 1 hour, but I'll come to an end there for today. And I believe it is an hour. And we will resume tomorrow. So that's the end of lecture 6. Thank you very much.